Tonight, instead of opening a history book, you are opening a forgotten door that has remained quietly closed for centuries. Beyond it, you find no battlefield and hear no speeches echoing through a crowded hall. Instead, you see a wooded Virginia mountain rising gently above fields softened by evening light. Somewhere near its summit stands a house that seems both familiar and strangely private. You are approaching Monticello. Here the quieter details matter most. A bed fits into a wall, a clock stretches through the floor, books crowd small rooms, seeds arrive from distant countries, bottles disappear into hidden lifts, weather is written down almost every morning. And behind these inventions and elegant rooms are many other lives, including enslaved families whose labour made the household possible. For tonight's forgotten story quietly unfolds. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy relaxing journeys through history. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Imagine wandering through an old library after everyone else has gone home, following one quiet detail into another. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let history quietly unfold around you. Section 1. You'll begin below the summit where the road curls slowly upward through the Virginia landscape. The air feels warmer beneath the trees. Leaves stir above you, and somewhere beyond the road, insects hum in the grass. The smell of damp earth rises from the shaded ground. Ahead lies a mountain Jefferson knew from childhood. Long before the famous house took shape, this high ground belonged to a larger world of family land, farms, forests, waterways, and neighbouring plantations. Jefferson inherited thousands of acres after the death of his father, Peter Jefferson, and the mountain eventually became the centre of his private ambitions. The name Monticello comes from Italian. It means roughly little mountain. Jefferson had a lifelong fascination with architecture, classical design languages, science, and European culture. Even the name he chose for his home quietly reflected that wider curiosity. As you climb, you begin to understand why the location appealed to him. The summit rises above the surrounding countryside, offering long views toward the Blue Ridge Mountains. In clear weather, ridges fade into the distance in layers of blue and grey. It feels removed from ordinary movement below. That isolation mattered. Jefferson enjoyed company sometimes to the point that Monticello became crowded with visitors. Yet he also valued privacy, reading, observation, correspondence, and long periods of concentrated work. The mountain allowed both worlds to exist together. Guests could arrive in numbers, while Jefferson could retreat behind carefully arranged rooms, narrow passages, and private spaces. The house you are approaching was never simply built once. Jefferson began serious construction in the late 760s. Work continued, stopped, changed direction, and began again over several decades. That is one of the first unusual things you discover about Monticello. It was less like a finished house and more like a lifelong experiment. Jefferson altered plans after travelling in Europe. He became especially interested in buildings he saw in France and in the classical architecture described by writers such as Andrea Palladio. When he returned home, Monticello changed with him. Walls moved, rooms were reconsidered, the roofline changed. A dome eventually appeared above the central portion of the house, giving the building the familiar silhouette you recognise today. Yet from the mountain road, much of the structure remains hidden. Jefferson designed Monticello to appear lower than it truly was. Service rooms and workspaces were placed partly beneath the main living level and along dependencies extending from the house. From certain viewpoints, the building seems elegant and compact. But beneath that calm appearance, an enormous amount of work was taking place. Wood had to be cut, bricks had to be made, stone had to be quarried, food had to be grown, preserved, carried, cooked and served, laundry had to be washed, fires had to be maintained, horses required care, visitors required beds, and much of this work was performed by enslaved men, women and children. As you continue upward, that fact changes how the mountain looks. Monticello was Jefferson's home, but it was also a plantation. Hundreds of enslaved people lived and worked on Jefferson's properties during his lifetime. Some laboured in fields. Others became skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, nail makers, textile workers, cooks, domestic servants, wagoners, gardeners, and craftsmen. Many belonged to extended families who lived on or near the mountain for generations. Their homes were far simpler than Jefferson's. Some stood along Mulberry Row, a narrow working area near the main house where workshops, storage buildings, dwellings and small industries formed the practical heart of the plantation. You will walk there later. For now, the road keeps climbing. Jefferson once described the mountain and its views with great affection. He carefully watched changes in weather, plant seasons and temperature from this elevated place. From here, clouds could be observed moving across distant ridges. Storms approached visibly. Morning mist sometimes settled in the valleys below while the summit remained above it. You can imagine why a person obsessed with measurement might enjoy such a position. The mountain itself became an observing platform. Jefferson recorded temperatures and weather conditions for years. He measured rainfall, followed seasonal changes, and compared the climate of Virginia with places elsewhere. His interest was not always systematic by the modern scientific standards, but it was persistent. I wanted patterns. Monticello gave him a place to search for them. You reach a point where the trees begin to open. The house now comes slowly into view. Its brick walls glow gently in the fading light. Pale columns stand against darker windows. The dome rises above the roof, unusual for an American private home of its period. The building feels balanced, almost serene, yet that serenity hides decades of revision. Jefferson could be extraordinarily particular about small details. Measurements, proportions, furniture placement, window shapes, mechanical devices and room functions received careful attention. Some ideas worked beautifully, others were inconvenient. A few were simply eccentric. That is part of Monticello's charm. You are not entering the home of someone satisfied with ordinary solutions. You are entering the workshop of a mind that kept asking whether a door could move differently, whether a room could serve two purposes, or whether a household task could be concealed behind architecture. Even the landscape around the house was shaped according to experiments. Gardens stretched along the mountain. Fruit trees grew in carefully planned areas. Vegetables arrived from Europe and other parts of the world. Jefferson recorded planting dates and noted which varieties succeeded. Yet historians still face limits when reconstructing exactly how every part of Monticello looked at particular moments. The house changed so frequently that there was no single permanent Monticello during Jefferson's adult life. Rooms evolved. Outbuildings appeared and disappeared. Working spaces shifted. The landscape itself changed with farming, construction, weather and time. So when you picture Monticello, you are really seeing a place in motion. That may be the best way to understand it. Not as a frozen monument, not as the perfectly preserved home of a famous founder, but as a busy mountain community filled with sawdust, smoke, footsteps, conversation, cooking smells, hammering letters, visitors, animals, children, workers, experiments and unfinished plans. As evening settles over the summit, the house grows quieter in your imagination. Light fades from the western mountains. The brick turns darker. Windows reflect the last pale colour of the sky. And somewhere inside beyond those doors lies the first of many small surprises. Because Jefferson did not merely build rooms, and designed ways of moving through them. And once you cross the threshold, you begin to discover how strange this apparently graceful house could become. Section 2. You cross the threshold and leave the evening air behind. For a moment, the house feels cooler than the mountain outside. Brick, plaster, polished wood and old glass soften the sounds around you. Your footsteps seem quieter here, as if the rooms themselves prefer careful movement. At first, Monticello appears orderly. The entrance hall opens before you with symmetry and calm proportions. Light enters through tall windows. Objects hang on the walls. Maps, portraits, antlers, and curious specimens turn the space into something more than an ordinary hallway. But the deeper you look, the less ordinary the house becomes. You are walking through a building that Jefferson spent most of his adult life changing. Construction began when he was still a young man, long before he had seen the grand houses and public buildings of France. His first plans reflected the architectural books he studied, especially the work of the Italian Renaissance architect Andrea Palladio. Jefferson admired proportion, he admired geometry, and perhaps most of all he admired the possibility that a house could express ideas. The earliest Monticello rose gradually from the mountaintop during the 1770s. It was already ambitious, yet Jefferson was rarely satisfied for long. When you imagine him returning from Europe in 1789, you can picture him looking at the house with different eyes. He had spent years in France where he visited buildings, studied gardens, measured rooms, examined domes and collected architectural ideas. Monticello suddenly seemed unfinished again, so he began changing it. The transformation would continue for years. You move slowly through the central hall and notice one of Jefferson's favourite architectural tricks. From outside the house seems largely one story tall. Inside, however, rooms appear above you. The upper floor is partly hidden behind the balustrade and roofline, allowing the exterior to preserve the low classical proportions Jefferson admired. It is a clever illusion. The house appears simpler than it really is. This desire to conceal practical complexity becomes a pattern at Monticello. Jefferson wanted certain parts of daily life to remain visually quiet. Staircases were narrow, service areas were tucked away, storage disappeared into walls. Household work could continue behind the smooth surfaces experienced by guests. Even the stairs feel surprising. They are steep and confined compared with the grand staircases found in many wealthy homes of the period. Jefferson disliked wasting valuable space on large stair halls, so instead of giving stairs a dramatic architectural role, he compressed them. You place one imaginary hand against the wall as you climb. The steps rise sharply. Light is limited. It feels more like moving through a private passage than ascending through the center of an important residence. That choice tells you something about the house. Monticello was designed according to Jefferson's priorities, not according to every social convention of the time. Rooms mattered more than staircases. Books mattered more than ceremony. Views mattered. Light mattered. Efficiency mattered, at least in theory. Yet some of Jefferson's clever ideas created inconvenience as easily as comfort. You return to the main level and look upward. Above the central portion of the house rises the dome. Today is one of Monticello's most recognizable features. In Jefferson's time, it was highly unusual for a private American house. The dome was influenced partly by European architectural models Jefferson had admired. Its curved form gave the exterior a sense of refinement, but inside it produced a strange octagonal room beneath the roof. You enter it in your imagination. Light arrives through windows arranged around the walls. The shape is elegant. The space feels almost detached from the practical life of the rest of the house. And strangely, no one seems to have found a consistently useful purpose for it. The dome room was beautiful, but beauty did not guarantee usefulness. At different times, it may have served for storage lodging or other occasional purposes, yet its precise use was not always clearly documented. Historians can reconstruct much of Monticello from Jefferson's drawings, written records, archaeology, and surviving architecture, but some daily functions remain uncertain. That uncertainty makes the room feel even quieter. You stand beneath the curved ceiling and imagine generations of footsteps that left few written explanations. Then you descend again. The house below seems more crowded with purpose. Jefferson carefully shaped rooms around particular activities. There was a cabinet for work, a book room for reading, a greenhouse-like space for plants, a parlor for conversation and music, a dining room built around meals and company. Bedrooms were fitted into spaces where every foot seemed considered. Doors and windows were positioned to control movement and sightlines. Nothing feels entirely accidental. Even ceiling heights become part of the design. Jefferson experimented with different room proportions, rather than repeating one standard shape throughout the house. Some spaces feel intimate, others open upward with surprising volume. The parlor, for example, rises higher than several neighboring rooms. You can imagine voices lifting gently toward the ceiling while evening light spreads across the floor. Music might have sounded here. Guests might have talked for hours. Children might have moved through the room while adults discussed books, farming, travel, or politics. Yet behind these polished spaces, the building depended on hidden labor. Enslaved workers helped manufacture bricks, cut timber, shape nails, quarry stone, construct walls, prepare plaster, and complete many of the physical tasks required by Jefferson's changing designs. Some were highly skilled craftsmen. Their knowledge became part of the architecture, even when their names were absent from the stories later told about the house. As you run your eyes along a wall, the surface no longer seems anonymous. Someone mixed the mortar. Someone lifted the brick. Someone shaped the timber hidden above the ceiling. Someone repaired the building when weather damaged it. Monticello's architecture belonged not only to Jefferson's imagination, but also to the hands that made that imagination solid. The mountain complicated construction. Almost everything required effort to bring upward. Materials had to be produced nearby or transported over difficult roads. Work could be delayed by weather, money, labor shortages, changing plans, and Jefferson's frequent absences. This helps explain why Monticello seemed permanently unfinished. Jefferson was redesigning faster than the house could settle. You imagine a carpenter completing one detail while another alteration was already being considered. A doorway might change. A roofline might be reconsidered. A window might move. A room could gain an entirely new purpose. Years became decades. Jefferson's family learned to live inside an architectural experiment. That is one of the quieter truths of Monticello. The house we now treat as a finished historic object was experienced by its residents as something far less fixed. There were periods of construction dust, hammering, unfinished surfaces, workers passing through, materials waiting for installation, plans still unfolding. The famous house was also a work site. You pause near one of the windows. Outside, the last light rests over the lawn. Beyond it, the land falls away toward trees and distant ridges. Jefferson designed important rooms to take advantage of these views. He wanted architecture and landscape to speak to one another. From inside the mountain enters through the glass. From outside the house appears to belong to the summit. But even that harmony is carefully constructed. Monticello was not merely placed upon the mountain. The summit itself was reshaped. Ground was leveled. Terraces were formed. Roads were directed. Gardens were laid out. The natural landscape became another material in Jefferson's design. And still he kept revising. Even late in life, small improvements continued. A door, a shelf, a mechanism, a piece of furniture, or a garden arrangement could still attract his attention. Perfection remained somewhere ahead. Perhaps that is why the house feels so personal. Monticello never quite reached a moment when Jefferson could simply declare it complete and leave it alone. It changed because he changed. The young planter who first imagined the house was not the same man who returned from France, and neither was quite the same aging figure who later sat surrounded by grandchildren, books, letters, debts, and memories. The architecture preserved all those versions at once. You leave the central rooms and move toward the quieter, private side of the house. The public spaces begin to recede behind you. The floorboards creak faintly. Light grows softer. Ahead lies one of Jefferson's most unusual arrangements. A narrow bed seems to disappear directly into the wall, and on the other side of that bed waits the small room where Jefferson spent countless private hours reading, writing, measuring, and thinking. Section 3. You move away from the larger rooms and enter the quieter part of Monticello. The light changes here. Outside, the Virginia evening has deepened, and the windows now hold only a pale reflection of the sky. Inside, polished wood catches small pools of warm light. The air seems still carrying the faint, imagined scent of paper, linen, fireplace ash, and old furniture. Ahead, you notice something unusual. Jefferson's bed does not stand freely in the middle of a bedroom. Instead, it disappears into the wall. The bed occupies an alcove built between two rooms, with one side opening toward Jefferson's bedchamber and the other toward his private cabinet. You can almost walk around his sleeping place without ever walking around the bed itself. It is a remarkably compact arrangement. Jefferson liked the idea of using space carefully, and the alcove allowed one piece of furniture to connect two different parts of his private life. On one side was sleep, on the other was work. When you imagine waking here, you do not picture a grand ceremonial bedroom filled with unnecessary furniture. You picture a man opening his eyes only a few feet from books, papers, instruments, letters, and the small devices that occupied so much of his attention. Morning and thought were separated by little more than bedding. The arrangement feels almost modern in its efficiency, though the room belongs unmistakably to the early 19th century. You look closer at the alcove. The mattress sits inside a wooden recess framed by the wall. Curtains could provide warmth and privacy, especially during colder months when the mountain air settled heavily around the house. Virginia winters were not always gentle. Cold drafts entered through doors and windows. Fireplaces warmed rooms unevenly. Heavy fabric layered, clothing blankets, and enclosed sleeping spaces helped preserve precious warmth. The alcove could feel sheltered, but it also had another advantage. Jefferson could rise directly toward his cabinet. That small working room becomes your next destination. You step through the imaginary opening beside the bed and enter a space shaped around one person's habits. This was not a formal office designed to impress visitors. It was a working room. Here Jefferson surrounded himself with objects he expected to use. Books rested close at hand. Papers accumulated. Writing tools waited on tables. Scientific instruments occupied convenient positions. Light entered through windows that connected the interior to the mountain landscape beyond. I begin to understand why the bed belonged exactly where it did. Jefferson tried to organize his environment so that movement between activities required little effort. Sleeping, dressing, reading, writing, measuring, and observing could all happen within a remarkably small private territory. The effect is intimate. For all the scale of Jefferson's public reputation, much of his daily life depended on small repeated routines. Niwok. He looked at the weather. He read. He wrote. He received information. He recorded things, and then he repeated much of it the following day. You imagine morning arriving gradually across the mountain. The sky beyond the windows turns from grey to pale blue. Birds begin calling from the trees. Moisture rests on grass outside. Somewhere below the main room's fires are being prepared. Footsteps begin along service passages. Enslaved workers are already beginning another day of labor across Monticello. Inside the alcove, Jefferson wakes close to sunrise. I was known for keeping early hours, and his surviving records show a strong interest in observing temperature and weather conditions near the beginning of the day. You can picture him leaving the blankets while the room is still cool. The floor beneath his feet would feel cold. He dresses in layers appropriate to the season. Clothing in Jefferson's lifetime required more fastening, arranging, and adjusting than the simple garments familiar today. Shirt stockings, waistcoats, coats, breeches, and shoes each belonged to a daily routine that could change with weather and circumstance. Jefferson's clothes also revealed another side of his personality. He could appreciate fine European goods, yet accounts from later in his life sometimes describe him as relatively informal at home. Monticello allowed him to relax certain expectations that surrounded public life. You can imagine the contrast. A visitor arriving with an image of a grand statesman might instead encounter an aging man dressed comfortably within his own household. Descriptions differ and recollections written later must always be approached carefully. Memory softens edges. It exaggerates some details and forgets others. Exactly how Jefferson looked during every private morning cannot be reconstructed. That uncertainty belongs naturally to the room. Historical houses preserve walls far more easily than habits. Still objects provide clues. You notice the furniture first. Jefferson often preferred pieces that could serve more than one function. Tables supported reading and writing. Shelves kept frequently used books close. Mechanical devices helped copy correspondence. Small arrangements reduced unnecessary movement. The cabinet feels almost like the interior of a carefully packed ship. Everything seems designed to place knowledge within reach. Even the chair matters. Jefferson owned a revolving chair. An unusual piece for the period, allowing him to turn between different surfaces without repeatedly standing. You can imagine him rotating gently from one task toward another. A book rests here. A letter waits there. A notebook needs an entry. A thermometer requires attention. The movement is small, but it reveals his constant desire to make ordinary actions slightly more efficient. Not every experiment achieved that goal. Some of Jefferson's inventions and arrangements were more ingenious than practical. Yet he rarely seemed discouraged by the inconvenience. The possibility of improvement attracted him. The same restless habit that reshaped Monticello for decades also shaped this tiny working room. You look back toward the alcove bed. Its location now feels less eccentric. The bed is almost part of the machinery of the cabinet. Sleep ends and work begins immediately. But there is another side to this efficiency. Jefferson's ability to devote so much time to reading, writing, scientific curiosity, and architectural experimentation depended on a household supported by enslaved labor. While he organized his private hours around intellectual work, other people cooked his food, cleaned rooms, tended fires, cared for horses, made clothing, maintained gardens, carried messages, repaired buildings, and performed countless tasks necessary for daily life. Some of those people moved only a short distance from this chamber. Their labor was essential even when Jefferson's architecture made it easy for visitors not to see them. The quiet cabinet therefore holds two histories at once. One concerns curiosity and invention. The other concerns the unequal structure that made such a life possible. You do not need to raise your voice to notice the contradiction. It is already present in the room. Morning light strengthens. The bedclothes are left behind and papers begin to take their place at the center of Jefferson's attention. Letters were especially important. He maintained an enormous correspondence throughout his life and writing could consume hours. But before following those letters across the country and the Atlantic, you notice another object governing the household. Time itself has been built into Monticello, not merely measured. Displayed, organized, almost engineered into the architecture. You leave Jefferson's private cabinet and move back toward the entrance hall. The rooms brighten as morning spreads across the mountain. Ahead, a large clock hangs above the doorway. Its face seems conventional at first. Then you notice cables descending from it. Heavy weights move slowly downward, and strangely the mechanism continues beyond the floor beneath your feet. At Monticello, even knowing what day it is becomes an architectural experience. Section 4. You leave Jefferson's private rooms and return toward the entrance hall where the house seems to open around you again. Morning light reaches farther across the floor. Somewhere beyond the doors, the mountain is waking with birds calling from the trees and hooves sounding softly on packed earth. A distant cart may creak along a road below. Then your attention returns to the clock. It hangs above the entrance doors large enough that no visitor could easily ignore it. From inside you see a broad dial with hour and minute hands along with a smaller hand marking seconds. On the opposite side of the wall, another face can be read from outdoors, allowing people beyond the house to know the hour as well. Jefferson wanted one mechanism to serve two worlds at once, the formal interior of Monticello and the working plantation outside Monticello. You stand beneath it and listen to a quiet tick, followed by a pause and another tick. The sound is small, but the mechanism is not. The great clock was designed according to Jefferson's ideas and made in Philadelphia in the early 1790s. Like many objects at Monticello, it began with a practical purpose and became something more elaborate, Monticello. Its most memorable feature is not the face but the weights. On both sides of the entrance doors, sets of heavy spherical weights hang from long cords. They slowly descend as the clock runs. Once each week, the mechanism must be wound again, raising those weights toward the ceiling. Monticello. Jefferson transformed that downward movement into a second kind of clock. Along the wall, labels mark the days of the week. As one set of weights descends, its position indicates not only the passing hours but the passing days. Sunday begins high above, You followed below by Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday in Monticello. And here Monticello gives you one of its most charming mechanical mistakes. The wall is not tall enough. When the clock was installed, the cords and descending weights required more vertical distance than the entrance hall could provide. Jefferson's solution was wonderfully characteristic. Instead of abandoning the design, he allowed the weights to continue downward through holes cut into the floor. Monticello. You follow them with your eyes as Friday appears close to the bottom of the hall and Saturday disappears below. To discover the final day of the clock's weekly journey, you must go downstairs where the Saturday marker belongs on the basement level. Monticello. A small miscalculation became permanent architecture. You can almost imagine Jefferson accepting the inconvenience with quiet satisfaction. The clock still worked, so the building simply had to adapt to the machine. This unusual arrangement reveals the way he often approached problems. If an idea nearly worked, he could redesign the surroundings until it worked well enough. You listen again. The great clock did more than tick. It was connected to a gong positioned above the house, so the passing hours could be announced beyond the entrance hall. The sound carried outward into a much larger landscape. Monticello. Imagine standing on the mountain in the early 19th century. You may be in a garden working near Mulberry Row, carrying materials between buildings or approaching the house as a guest. Then the hour sounds, and for a moment many people across Monticello hear the same note. But they do not experience time in the same way. For Jefferson, a marked hour might organize reading, correspondence, meals, visitors, or observation. For an enslaved worker, the same hour might fall within a day governed by assigned labor, household demands, agricultural seasons, and the authority of others. The clock was shared while control over time was not. That difference is easy to overlook when you stand beneath such an ingenious object. The falling weights are almost playful. Yet the clock also belonged to a plantation system in which hundreds of daily tasks had to be coordinated. Time helped organize labor. Meals needed preparation before they were served, fires had to be lit before rooms became comfortable, and horses had to be ready when journeys began. Gardens followed daylight and weather, while letters waited for riders and postal schedules. Visitors arrived unpredictably, and the household had to absorb them. A clock could not control all of this, but it could give the mountain a common rhythm. Jefferson himself was fascinated by the measurement far beyond the entrance hall. He owned and used several kinds of timekeeping devices. He paid attention to hours, distances, temperatures, rainfall, plantings, expenses, books, and correspondence. Monticello. His papers often reveal a mind reluctant to let ordinary experience pass without leaving some record behind. Yet there is a gentle irony here. The man who measured so much never succeeded in making his own life orderly. Monticello remained unfinished for decades. His finances became increasingly troubled, visitors interrupted his routines, and family members filled the house. Letters multiplied, farms refused to behave like neat calculations, weather ignored plans, and the clock itself sent Saturday through the floor. You pause beneath it, noticing how perfectly that small floor belongs here. Monticello is full of systems designed by someone who believed the world could be made more rational. Then reality enters. A wall proves too short a harvest, disappoints, a machine requires adjustment. A household becomes crowded or a debt grows. The plan changes, yet the measurements continue. You can imagine Jefferson passing through the entrance hall many times each day and glancing upward almost automatically. Perhaps he checks the minute hand. Perhaps he notices how far the weights have descended, or hears the gong while reading elsewhere. The clock becomes part of the background of life. Children hear it, guests hear it, domestic workers hear it, and people moving along the mountaintop hear it. Day after day, the machine quietly divides time into pieces. Historians can describe its mechanism and trace Jefferson's plans for it with unusual detail, but they cannot recover every reaction to its sound. Perhaps children waited for the gong before a meal, or workers used it to estimate when a task might end. Guests may have found the descending weights ingenious or strange, while someone living nearby may simply have stopped noticing them. The documents cannot answer every question, so you allow the uncertainty to remain. The hall feels calmer because of it. You look at the clock once more, not as a museum object, but as something alive within a working house. The weights creep downward while the hands advance, and another portion of the day quietly passes. Around this measured rhythm, Monticello continues to move. Doors open, meals travel, letters arrive, and boots cross floors. Servants and enslaved workers move through passages that guests barely notice. Soon you begin to notice those passages too. Jefferson's fascination with efficiency did not stop with clocks. He placed mechanisms into walls, hid movement behind doors, and designed ways for food and wine to appear without revealing every hand that carried them. And as you leave the entrance hall, one of those quiet devices is waiting just beyond the next room. Section 5. You leave the entrance hall while the great clock continues its patient descent behind you. Its weights move almost too slowly to notice, but the house around them feels full of hidden motion. Doors open and close, footsteps cross distant floors, food travels from one space to another, bottles rise from below, servants appear, then vanish again. At Monticello, movement was often designed to disappear. You enter the dining room where the atmosphere feels warmer and more intimate than the entrance hall. Light rests softly on polished wood. The room seems arranged for conversation meals and long evenings around the table. Then you notice that the walls are doing more than simply holding up the ceiling. Some of them move. Jefferson was fascinated by the mechanisms that could save space, reduce visible clutter, or make ordinary tasks seem almost effortless. In several parts of Monticello, he built devices directly into the architecture. The dining room offers some of the best examples. Near the fireplace you find what looks at first like an ordinary section of wall, but it turns. A revolving serving door could carry plates and dishes between the dining room and the service area beyond. Food placed on one side could rotate into the room without someone needing to walk through the doorway each time. The effect must have seemed remarkably smooth. A guest seated at dinner might watch a dish appear as if the house itself had delivered it. You can imagine the quiet surprise. The wood turns. A plate arrives. Conversation continues, yet the mechanism did not remove labour. It simply hid part of it. On the other side, someone had prepared the dish, carried it forward, placed it carefully, and waited for the revolving door to return. That person was often enslaved. This is one of the most important things to remember as you explore Jefferson's clever devices. The machinery did not make Monticello self-sufficient. It made labour less visible. Jefferson was interested in creating a household that appeared orderly and efficient, but the appearance depended on people moving constantly behind walls, beneath floors, through kitchens, along passages, and across the grounds. You continue along the dining room. Another device catches your attention. Small dumbwaiters were built near the fireplace. These narrow lifts connected the dining room to the wine cellar below. A bottle could be placed on a small platform downstairs, then raised by rope and pulley to the room above. Again, the movement feels almost magical. You imagine a dinner in progress. Candles flicker. Glasses reflect warm light. Conversation moves slowly around the table. Then, a bottle rises from below, appearing beside the fireplace without an enslaved servant entering the room. Jefferson appreciated this kind of arrangement. It allowed the dining space to remain visually quiet. It may also have offered guests a greater sense of privacy during conversation, but the bottle still had to be selected. Someone still carried it through the cellar. Someone still loaded the lift. Someone still managed the invisible work. Monticello repeatedly invites you to look at both sides of a mechanism. The visible side is elegant. The hidden side is labour. You follow that hidden side now. Beyond the formal rooms, narrow corridors and service spaces connect parts of the house that guests were not meant to notice. These passages are smaller. The ceilings feel lower. Light becomes dimmer. Walls are more practical. You can imagine the temperature changing as well. Near the kitchen, the air grows warmer and carries the smell of smoke, hot iron, roasting meat, bread, vegetables, and wood fires. Elsewhere, cool basement rooms hold bottles, preserved foods, tools, and household supplies. The contrast between these spaces and Jefferson's public rooms is striking. Upstairs, the house appears calm. Below, it works. You hear pots. You hear footsteps. You hear doors. You hear the dull sound of wood being set down. Perhaps someone calls quietly from one room to another. The architecture separates these sounds whenever possible. Jefferson wanted guests to experience comfort without constantly seeing its preparation. That desire was not unique among wealthy households of his era. Large homes often separated service work from formal rooms, but Monticello carried the idea further through unusually inventive devices. Some doors seemed to behave like furniture. Some walls concealed storage. Narrow staircases connected levels without dominating the interior. Service passages allowed people to move through the building while remaining largely outside the sightlines of guests. I begin to notice how carefully Jefferson controlled what could be seen. A doorway is not only a doorway. It directs attention. A wall is not only a wall. It hides movement. A staircase is not only a staircase. It determines who passes where. Architecture quietly organizes social relationships. That realization changes the feeling of the house. You can stand in a beautiful room and enjoy its proportions while also understanding that its beauty was partly created through separation. Jefferson could sit at dinner while much of the physical effort behind the meal remained outside his immediate view. He could receive wine from below without walking to the cellar. He could move between study and bedroom with remarkable efficiency. He could design an environment in which his own movements became easier because other people's movements became hidden. This arrangement reveals much about Monticello. It also reveals much about Jefferson, and often admired systems. He enjoyed imagining how objects could move more efficiently. He liked arrangements that reduced wasted motion. Yet his idea of efficiency existed within a plantation society where enslaved people had very little control over the labour expected from them. The house is therefore ingenious and unequal at the same time. Both truths belong here. You pass beside one of the revolving doors. Its surface looks simple. You place an imaginary hand against it and feel the smooth resistance of wood and hidden hardware. When it turns, one room briefly becomes another. Then the opening disappears again. There is something almost theatrical about it. Monticello often behaves like a stage. Guests see the finished scene. Behind it, people prepare everything required to keep the performance moving. You continue toward the basement level. The air cools slightly as you descend. These rooms are less decorative, but no less important. Storage areas, wine cellars, food preparation spaces, and service rooms formed a network beneath the elegant house above. Their exact use changed over time. Monticello itself was continually altered, and historians sometimes must rely on archaeology surviving records, architectural evidence, and later descriptions to understand how particular spaces functioned during specific years. That uncertainty is useful. It reminds you that a house is not frozen. A room used one way in 1805 might have been used differently years later. A passage might be modified. A storage space might gain a new purpose. A mechanism might break and be repaired. The hidden Monticello changed just as the visible one did. You climb again toward the main floor. The formal rooms feel brighter after the basement. Sunlight crosses the boards. Outside leaves move in the mountain breeze. For a moment, everything seems still, but now you know better. Behind the polished surfaces, the house remains busy. Someone is carrying water. Someone is tending fire. Someone is preparing food. Someone is cleaning. Someone is repairing something that visitors may never notice. And Jefferson, surrounded by this machinery of household life, is preparing to measure something else. Not doors, not bottles, not time. Eyes watching the sky. Soon you will find him near a window in the early morning, recording temperatures, observing clouds, and turning another ordinary part of life into a column of numbers. Section 6. You leave the hidden passages behind and return to a quieter corner of Monticello. Morning has fully reached the mountain now. Pale sunlight slides across the floorboards, touching the edges of books and wooden furniture. Outside the windows, dew still clings to grass. The air carries the cool freshness that often arrives before a Virginia day becomes warm. Jefferson is already awake. For him, morning is not simply the beginning of another day. It is another opportunity to observe. You imagine him approaching a window while the house is still relatively quiet. Somewhere nearby waits a thermometer. On another day, perhaps a rain gauge will require attention. Beyond the glass, clouds gather above distant ridges. Jefferson spent much of his life recording weather. Temperature particularly interested him. NEMAD, observations over many decades, sometimes taking readings twice in a single day. Morning and afternoon temperatures allowed him to compare the colder and warmer portions of daily weather. The habit suited him perfectly. Numbers gave shape to things that otherwise disappeared. A cold morning passes. A storm moves away. Rain sinks into the soil. But if you write something down, a small part of the moment remains. You stand beside him and look toward the Blue Ridge. Cloud shadows drift over the hills. Weather on a mountain top can feel especially visible. You see it approaching from far away, gathering above valleys and moving across slopes. Jefferson wanted to understand those changes. Her believed careful observation could reveal patterns in nature. His records included more than temperature. Rainfall interested him. Wind interested him. Frost mattered because it affected crops. The timing of seasons mattered because planting and harvesting depended upon them. Weather was therefore both scientific curiosity and practical concern. Monticello was surrounded by agriculture. Fields, orchards, gardens, and vineyards all lived according to conditions that Jefferson could measure but never command. A late frost could damage fruit. Too little rain could weaken crops. Too much rain could delay work. Heat might change when plants flowered or ripened. Every season offered another experiment. You imagine a small notebook opening. The page waits patiently. A figure is entered. Perhaps the sky is described. Perhaps rain from the previous night is noted. The gesture takes only moments. Repeated over years, however, such gestures become a remarkable record of attention. Jefferson was far from the only person of his era interested in weather. 18th century, Natural philosophers increasingly collected observations from different places, hoping to compare climates and understand patterns across large distances. Jefferson participated enthusiastically in this culture of measurement. He exchanged observations with other people and encouraged systematic record-keeping. For him, information became more valuable when it could be compared. Virginia against another state, 1 year against another, morning against afternoon, the mountain against the valley below. You can almost hear his mind arranging columns. Yet the instruments themselves were not perfect. Thermometers of the period could vary. Their placement mattered. Sunlight could distort a reading. Shelter wind walls and nearby structures could influence temperature. Methods were not standardized in the way modern weather stations would later become. So Jefferson's records must be understood within the scientific practices of his time. They are valuable precisely because they are old observations, not because every number carries modern precision. That small uncertainty makes the scene more human. Jefferson stands before the weather with instruments that offer clues rather than perfect answers. Nature refuses to become completely orderly. Still, he keeps writing. You turn from the thermometer toward the window. Down the mountain, people are already working. For enslaved laborers, weather was not an abstract subject. It touched the body directly. Cold hardened soil and stiffened fingers. Summer humidity settled heavily over fieldwork. Rain soaked clothing and turned paths to mud. Strong sun changed the pace and difficulty of outdoor labor. The same weather Jefferson recorded from his rooms was being experienced physically by people whose work sustained Monticello. Again, one mountain holds several different kinds of time. Jefferson measures the morning. Others must work through it. You follow the imagined path from his window toward the gardens. Soil darkened by moisture releases a rich smell. Leaves hold tiny droplets. Birds move through fruit trees. A gardener studies the ground before deciding what can be done that day. Agriculture requires this kind of attention too. Long before former instruments appeared, farmers understood weather through experience. They watched clouds. They felt changes in wind. They noticed when insects appeared. They observed flowering trees and the behavior of animals. Enslaved farmers and gardeners at Monticello possessed practical knowledge built through repeated seasons. Much of that knowledge was never written into the records with the same care Jefferson gave his own observations. That absence matters. A notebook may preserve the person holding the pen more clearly than the people surrounding him. You continue through the garden. Jefferson had a habit of recording natural events beyond temperature alone. He noted when certain plants bloomed. He watched agricultural cycles. He recorded the arrival or behavior of birds and other seasonal signs. Such observations belong to a broader attempt to understand the rhythm of the landscape. Sometimes those efforts produced clear information. Sometimes they produced questions. Jefferson famously took an interest in whether climate itself might change as forests were cleared and land was cultivated. People of his era debated whether settlement could alter local temperatures and weather patterns. Jefferson gathered evidence but could not settle the question. You sense his uncertainty. It's another reminder that curiosity does not always end with an answer. Sometimes a record simply becomes something future generations can examine. You return toward the house as the sun rises higher. The coolness begins to fade. Windows shine more brightly. Inside, the morning has become busier. Breakfast must be prepared. Messages may arrive. Visitors may appear. Letters wait to be answered. Yet Jefferson's interest in weather follows him even when he travels. He sometimes recorded observations away from Monticello, maintaining the larger habit of watching temperature and conditions wherever he happened to be. Measurement became part of his way of moving through the world. You might think such a person would have no patience for uncertainty, but his notebook suggests something more complicated. Jefferson recorded what he could. Then he returned the next day. There is something quietly peaceful about that repetition. No single morning explains a climate. No single rainfall explains a season. Understanding grows through accumulation. One temperature, one cloud, one frost, one page after another. You pause near the window again. Outside, the weather has already changed from the moment you arrived. A thin cloud passes across the sun. The room darkens gently, then brightens again. Jefferson may have liked numbers, but Monticello continually reminded him that the natural world moved on its own terms. Perhaps that was part of the attraction. Every answer created another observation. Every season began another test. And when weather had been written down for the morning, there were still hundreds of other things waiting to be examined. Across the house, strange objects fill shelves and walls. Maps describe distant places. Bones hint at vanished animals. Scientific instruments wait beside books. Artifacts from indigenous cultures sit among European paintings and personal curiosities. Monticello is beginning to feel less like an ordinary home and more like a private cabinet of the world. You leave the window and follow that curiosity into the next room. Section 7. You leave the morning window behind and move deeper into Monticello, where Jefferson's habit of measuring the world gives way to another habit entirely. He collected it. Not the whole world, of course. Of course. But sometimes the entrance hall and nearby rooms make it seem as though he tried. Light falls across walls crowded with objects that do not normally belong together. Maps share space with paintings. Antlers extend outward above visitors. Bones suggest animals that once wandered across landscapes far beyond Virginia. Everywhere you look, something seems to ask a question. Jefferson did not arrange Monticello like a modern museum. There are no neat labels explaining every object. Instead, the house reflects the broad curiosity of an 18th century gentleman interested in natural history, geography, and indigenous cultures, technology, art, architecture, and the rapidly expanding knowledge of the continent around him. I begin in the entrance hall. A visitor arriving here would have understood immediately that this was not simply a waiting room. The walls themselves were meant to educate. Maps helped describe the geography of North America. Objects connected with indigenous peoples offered glimpses, however, incomplete and filtered through Jefferson's perspective of cultures extending far beyond Virginia. Animal specimens and bones suggested the natural history of a continent Europeans still understood imperfectly. You turn slowly. There are antlers. There are horns. There are curious shapes whose purpose might not be obvious until someone explains them. The hall feels like a conversation Jefferson has arranged between distant places. Some objects came through travelers. Others arrived through correspondence. Still others were connected with government expeditions and Jefferson's wide network of acquaintances. His years in public life allowed unusual things to travel toward Monticello. Once they arrived, many became part of the house. You imagine a guest standing exactly where you stand. Perhaps the journey up the mountain has been long and dusty. A servant opens the door. The visitor steps inside expecting portraits and furniture. Instead, a collection of natural and cultural objects surrounds them. Before Jefferson even enters the room, the house has already announced his curiosity. Among the objects associated with Monticello were items connected with the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson had supported that journey westward while serving as president, and the expedition returned with information about landscapes, plants, animals, and native nations unfamiliar to many Americans in the East. Some specimens and artifacts eventually reached him. To Jefferson, they represented knowledge. But from your position 2 centuries later, you also notice another layer. Objects created by indigenous people did not begin their lives as curiosities. They belonged to living societies with languages, traditions, political systems, families, and histories of their own. Placed inside Monticello, they entered a different story. The meaning Jefferson gave them was not necessarily the meaning their makers would have recognized. You allow that difference to remain visible. It makes the collection more interesting, not less. You continue toward another object that fascinated Jefferson deeply. Bones. The young United States seemed to contain an astonishing number of large fossil remains. Some belonged to animals no longer found alive. Jefferson was deeply interested in these discoveries, particularly the remains of large mammals. One creature especially captured his imagination. It became known as the giant ground sloth Megalonyx. When Jefferson first studied unusual fossil bones sent to him from a cave in what is now West Virginia, their identity was not immediately understood. At first, he interpreted them as belonging to an enormous cat-like animal. Further comparison changed that conclusion. The bones instead belonged to a giant extinct sloth. Eventually, the animal's scientific name would preserve Jefferson's connection to its early study. You imagine one of those heavy fossil bones resting on a table. It carries a strange kind of silence. A living creature moved with it thousands of years before Monticello existed. Forests changed. Generation passed. The animal vanished. Then someone found the bone and sent it towards a man on a Virginia mountain who wanted desperately to understand what it meant. Extinction itself was still a difficult idea during Jefferson's lifetime. Naturalists were debating whether entire species could truly disappear from the earth. Jefferson remained reluctant for a time to accept that some large animals were permanently extinct. The unexplored western regions of North America seemed vast enough that perhaps living versions still survived somewhere. Today you know otherwise. But it is easy to understand the uncertainty of someone living before modern paleontology had fully developed. The map contained enormous blank spaces. A vanished animal might simply be hiding beyond them. You step toward another cluster of objects. Jefferson also collected scientific instruments. Some helped him measure weather. Others supported surveying astronomy, mathematics, or drawing. He admired devices that transformed invisible things into visible information. Temperature became a number. Direction became an angle. Distance became a measurement. Time became the movement of a hand across a dial. Even copying a letter could become a mechanical process. There is something consistent in all of this. Jefferson seemed uncomfortable allowing information simply to pass through his life. He wanted to preserve it. A plant could be listed. A book could be catalogued. A temperature could be recorded. A fossil could be classified. A map could turn unfamiliar territory into lines on paper. Yet classification always has limits. The more you look around the collection, the more clearly those limits appear. Some objects survive without complete histories. Their paths to Monticello may be undertone. Descriptions in old documents can be vague, disappear from inventories. Labels change. Later owners move things. Families remember one story while written records suggest another. The Monticello you visit through surviving evidence is therefore partly reconstructed. Historians compare Jefferson's papers, household inventories, archaeological discoveries, old descriptions, and surviving objects to determine what may have stood where. Sometimes the answer is strong, sometimes it remains only probable. You move into another room where paintings and portraits create a different kind of collection. Jefferson surrounded himself with images of people he admired. There were thinkers, political figures, explorers, and historical personalities. Paintings carried memory in a way fossils carried deep time. Books preserved voices. Maps preserved space. Portraits preserved faces. Monticello gradually became a physical version of Jefferson's mind. Not a tidy mind. A crowded one. A room could contain reminders of ancient Rome, modern France, Virginia, agriculture, Western geography, natural history, and family life within only a few steps. You'll begin to sense how overwhelming the house could become. Jefferson accumulated knowledge faster than he could comfortably store it. Books multiplied. Papers multiplied. Specimens arrived. Gifts accumulated. Objects from Europe found places beside American materials. Even furniture sometimes became part of an experiment. The collecting habit had practical consequences. Things require space. They require care. They collect dust. They break. They must be moved when rooms change. And Monticello was already a house under constant revision. You imagine enslaved domestic workers cleaning carefully around delicate instruments, books, mounted objects, and unfamiliar specimens. The collection that expressed Jefferson's intellectual life created additional physical labor for other people. Again, curiosity and labor occupy the same room. The polished object has another history behind it. You return slowly toward the hall. The antlers seem different now. So do the maps. They are no longer merely decorations. Together they reveal a person attempting to bring an enormous world within reach. But one collection at Monticello eventually became larger and more important to Jefferson than almost any other. It did not hang from walls or rest inside cabinets. It stood in rows. Thousands of volumes surrounded him, carrying languages, history, philosophy, gardening, architecture, science, law, poetry, mathematics, and almost every subject he believed worth knowing. You leave the specimens behind and follow the smell of leather bindings and paper. The next room is waiting quietly beneath the weight of books. Section 8. You leave the curious objects of the entrance hall behind and follow a different kind of collection. This one does not hang from antlers, rest inside cases, or arrive as a fossil from some distant cave. It waits in rows. Books surround you. Their leather spines catch the afternoon light, some darkened with age, others marked with gold lettering. Paper carries the faint dry scent of dust, ink, glue, and time. For Jefferson, books were not decoration. They were tools. You move toward the rooms connected with his private library and begin to understand how completely reading shaped his daily life. Jefferson read across an extraordinary range of subjects. Law stood beside history. Architecture stood beside agriculture. Mathematics shared space with philosophy. Classical languages appeared near works on science, gardening, geography, music, politics, and literature. To him, knowledge was not divided into narrow compartments. Everything seemed connected. A better understanding of architecture might improve a house. A study of agriculture might change a garden. A scientific observation might challenge an old assumption. A book about another country might suggest a new crop machine law or building style. You run your eyes along the imagined shelves. Some volumes are large and heavy. Others are small enough to hold comfortably in one hand. Written in languages other than English. Jefferson studied Latin and Greek and had considerable familiarity with French. He also took an interest in Italian and Spanish, especially when books in those languages offered information unavailable elsewhere. Reading could therefore become a form of travel. Without leaving the mountain, he could enter ancient Rome, 18th century Paris, Mediterranean vineyards, European libraries, or distant scientific debates. This partly explains why he found it difficult to stop buying books. He once expressed the idea that he could not live without them. The statement fits Monticello remarkably well. Books seem to press against nearly every part of his intellectual life. Yet Jefferson's most famous library did not remain here forever. After British forces burned the Congressional Library in Washington during the War of 1812, Jefferson offered his personal collection to Congress. The scale was remarkable. Thousands of his books eventually travelled from Monticello to Washington, forming the foundation of a new congressional collection. You imagine the mountain during that transition. Shelves that had once been crowded suddenly begin to empty. Boxes are prepared. Volumes are sorted. Heavy loads are carried from room to room and then down the mountain. A collection assembled through decades of reading begins another life elsewhere. The sale helped Jefferson financially, although his money troubles were far from solved. For another person, losing such a library might have ended the habit of collecting. For Jefferson, it did not. He began buying books again. The shelves slowly filled once more. There is something almost inevitable about it. You picture a package arriving at Monticello. Inside is a new volume. Perhaps Jefferson has heard about it from a correspondent. Perhaps a bookseller has sent a catalogue. Perhaps the subject touches one of his current interests. The book enters the house and another small space disappears from the shelf. Jefferson liked to organise books according to systems. His earlier major library was famously arranged around categories related to memory, reason, and imagination. History belonged broadly to memory. Philosophy and related subjects belonged to reason. The arts and literature belonged to imagination. The system reflected an old intellectual tradition, but Jefferson adapted it to suit his own collection. You can imagine him walking along a shelf and knowing where an idea should live. Classification gave physical shape to thought, yet books resisted perfect order just as weather and architecture did. One book might belong comfortably to several subjects. Another might arrive without an obvious place. A volume could be borrowed, misplaced, damaged, or moved. New interests required new categories. The library was therefore never completely still. Books moved because Jefferson moved through ideas. You enter his cabinet again, remembering the alcove bed only a few steps away. Here the intimacy of reading becomes clearer. Jefferson did not need to cross a large house to reach his books. Many were close to his working space. You imagine him seated early in the morning, opening a volume while the rest of the household is beginning its day. The pages feel slightly rough beneath his fingers. Light from the window changes as clouds pass outside. A fire may crackle during winter. In summer, warm air enters through an open window. Reading at Monticello was tied to the physical world around it. Jefferson also marked and recorded what he read. He collected quotations, took notes, and used books as sources for future thinking. Reading was rarely passive. A useful fact might lead to a letter. A new agricultural method might lead to an experiment. An architectural illustration might eventually become part of a building. A foreign recipe might find its way toward the kitchen. A discussion of vines might encourage another attempt at growing grapes. Books did not remain safely inside books. They escaped into Monticello. You can see this everywhere. Classical architecture appears in the shape of the house. European gardening ideas appear in the landscape. Scientific texts appear in Jefferson's measuring habits. Cookery and travel influence the table. The library quietly spreads through almost every room. Yet there is an important limit to this world of reading. Jefferson possessed opportunities unavailable to most people around him. Many enslaved people at Monticello were denied formal education, and Virginia laws and customs increasingly restricted literacy among enslaved communities. Some nevertheless learned to read or write through various circumstances, while others preserved knowledge through spoken tradition, skilled work, observation, and family teaching. A library therefore represents both access and exclusion. You stand among shelves filled with knowledge, while remembering how unevenly that knowledge could be reached. The contrast is quiet but unmistakable. Jefferson could order a book from across the Atlantic. An enslaved child living nearby might have little legal or practical opportunity to learn from it. The distance between those two lives could be only a few hundred yards. You continue along the shelves. Not every book Jefferson owned can now be traced with certainty. Collections were sold. Volumes were dispersed. Some disappeared. Later purchases complicated the record. Catalogues help historians reconstruct what he owned at particular times, but even detailed lists cannot tell you exactly which pages he read most closely. A person can own a book without finishing it. A sentence can shape a life without leaving a written note. A volume can sit untouched for years. This is one of the small uncertainties hidden inside any historical library. The shelf survives more easily than the act of reading. You imagine Jefferson reaching for one particular book at dusk. Why that one? Perhaps he needs an answer. Perhaps he is simply curious. Perhaps he wants to escape the endless stream of visitors, debts, plantation concerns, and correspondence. Reading can be practical. It can also be private. Outside evening begins to gather over the mountain again. The windows grow darker. Someone brings candles or tends a lamp. Shadows settle behind the rows of books. Jefferson may continue reading long after the landscape beyond the glass has disappeared. But books alone cannot keep his world connected. Monticello lies on a mountain, yet information constantly arrives and departs. Letters cross roads. Packets travel by ship. Messages come from family members, politicians, scientists, farmers, merchants, and strangers. Jefferson reads them, answers them, copies them, files them, and sends them back into the world. You close the imagined volume in your hands. The room becomes still. Then you notice the writing table nearby. Paper waits there in careful stacks. Ink is ready. And beside it sits a curious machine designed to make one moving pen create two letters at once. The library has brought the world to Jefferson. Now the correspondence will carry Jefferson back out into it. Section 9. You leave the shelves behind and settle beside Jefferson's writing table, where the quiet life of Monticello begins reaching far beyond the mountain. Paper waits in careful piles. Quills rest nearby. Ink darkens a small container. Outside the window evening gathers over Virginia, but on the desk another world remains awake. Letters arrive from everywhere. Some come from family members. Others come from farmers, scientists, politicians, merchants, booksellers, architects, former colleagues, curious strangers, and people asking Jefferson for advice or assistance. Thousands of surviving letters reveal just how deeply correspondence shaped his days. You imagine the sound of folded paper opening. The page may have travelled for weeks before reaching Monticello. Mud, rain, rough roads, unreliable coaches, river crossings, and changing weather all stood between sender and recipient. Nothing arrived instantly. A question sent today might not receive its answer for many weeks, sometimes longer. That slowness gave letters a different weight. Words had to travel physically. Someone carried them. A horse moved them along a road. A boat might take them across water. A post office sorted them before another rider continued the journey. When a letter finally reached Jefferson's desk, distance had already become part of its story. You picture him reading carefully. Some letters require quick replies. Others may be set aside. A few demand research among nearby books. Another may send him toward a map. Correspondence connects nearly every interest you have already encountered inside Monticello. Someone asks about plants. Someone discusses architecture. Another correspondent sends information about weather. Books are recommended. Seeds are exchanged. Scientific observations travel between distant households. Family concerns arrive beside public questions. Jefferson's writing table becomes a crossroads, yet answering so many letters creates a problem. If you send your only copy away, how do you remember exactly what you wrote? Jefferson cared deeply about preserving records. He wanted copies. At first, he used methods that required additional effort, including letter copying technology that transferred fresh ink onto thin paper. But another device would become much more closely associated with his desk. You notice it now, the polygraph. It resembles an unusual wooden writing instrument with connected arms and two pens. When Jefferson moves one pen across the page, the mechanism causes another pen to imitate the motion on a second sheet of paper. You write one letter. The machine writes two. At least that is the idea. You sit before it and imagine trying to form a sentence. Your hand moves slowly. The first pen scratches across one page. Beside it, the second pen follows. Every curve is repeated. Every line travels twice. The mechanism must be adjusted carefully so both pens move together. Ink must flow properly. Paper must remain positioned. The machine demands attention, but Jefferson loved it. For someone determined to preserve correspondence, the attraction is obvious. One copy can leave Monticello. The other can stay. You'll begin writing an imaginary letter. The linked arms move gently. Wooden joints shift. Metal fittings turn. Two nibias whisper across two sheets at nearly the same moment. It is one of Monticello's strangest sounds. Not loud enough to disturb the room. Only a faint double scratching. Jefferson became such an enthusiastic user of the polygraph that the machine became an important part of his working routine. He owned more than one over the years and took a continuing interest in improving its performance. A device that many people might regard as an interesting curiosity became for him an everyday tool that tells you something about Jefferson. He did not merely admire inventions from a distance. He liked to put them to work. You imagine him adjusting the mechanism after one pen begins drifting slightly away from the other. Perhaps the duplicate becomes less exact. Perhaps ink skips. Mechanical efficiency always brings its own maintenance. The machine intended to save effort also creates new small tasks. Monticello seems full of such irony. The clock requires winding. The dumb waiter requires someone below. The revolving door still requires hands on both sides. And the polygraph still requires Jefferson to write every word. No mechanism can answer the letter for him. So the hours accumulate. Jefferson often began working early, and correspondence could occupy a considerable portion of his day. You imagine letters slowly spreading across the desk. One response leads to another. A question reminds him of a book. The book reminds him of a person. That person receives another letter. A simple morning can become a web of paper stretching outward from the mountain. Some correspondence is deeply practical. Instruction must be sent, accounts discussed, goods ordered, travel arrangements made, family matters handled. Other letters allow Jefferson to explore ideas at great length. He exchanges thoughts about education, language, science, agriculture, government, religion, history, and countless other subjects. Even in retirement, the outside world keeps finding him. That could be exhausting. Monticello was meant to offer retreat, yet mail repeatedly crossed its boundaries. Visitors could arrive unexpectedly. Letters arrived with their own demands. A mountain home could not make Jefferson unreachable. In some ways, his reputation made privacy more difficult. You pass beside the desk and notice how carefully records were preserved. Copies mattered partly because Jefferson expected to return to old information. Dates mattered. Names mattered. The sequence of a conversation mattered. His habits eventually created a remarkable documentary trail, yet even this enormous archive has limits. Some letters vanished. Some were destroyed. Others survive only as copies. A correspondent may have preserved Jefferson's answer while Jefferson's own copy disappeared. Sometimes only one side of an exchange remains. You can read a response without knowing exactly what question produced it. That creates quiet gaps. Historians can reconstruct much, but correspondence never becomes a perfect window into a person. A letter is written for someone. The writer chooses what to reveal. Tune changes according to the recipient. Silences can be deliberate. Private feelings may remain unwritten. You therefore resist the temptation to believe that thousands of pages reveal everything. They reveal what reached paper. Life remained larger. That is especially important when considering the enslaved people living at Monticello. Jefferson left extensive written records, while many of those whose labor sustained his household left far fewer written documents in their own voices. The imbalance shapes what can be known. Jefferson's thoughts may survive in detailed sentences, and enslaved workers' experiences may appear only indirectly through inventories, work records, family histories, archaeology, or later recollection. The archive speaks unevenly. You notice that even in this peaceful room, one person has enough paper to preserve thousands of thoughts. Many others nearby do not have the same opportunity. Outside darkness has settled over the mountain. A candle flickers beside the writing table. The polygraph casts an angular shadow across the paper. Another letter is completed. Jefferson folds the outgoing sheet. The duplicate remains behind. Soon someone will carry the original away from Monticello. It may travel north toward Philadelphia or New York. It may go toward Washington. Another may travel only a short distance within Virginia. Some letters eventually cross the Atlantic. The mountain is quiet, yet Jefferson's words are moving in every direction. You look down at the desk one final time. Books bring distant ideas inward. Letters send ideas outward. Between those two motions, Monticello becomes less isolated than it first appeared. But thought alone does not fill a household. Beyond the cabinet, another rhythm is beginning. A table must be prepared. Fires are burning in the kitchen. Pots are warming. Vegetables, meats, breads, sauces, and desserts are moving through rooms you have already glimpsed from the other side of hidden doors. Soon the smell of dinner begins drifting upward, and following it will take you from Jefferson's papers into one of the busiest and most complicated parts of Monticello. Section 10. You leave the writing table behind and follow a different kind of movement through the house. The air has changed, where the cabinets smelled faintly of paper leather and ink. The corridor ahead carries warmer scents. Wood smoke drifts upward. Butter, herbs, roasted meat, bread, and vegetables gather into a soft mixture that tells you dinner is approaching. Monticello is becoming a kitchen before it becomes a dining room. You move downward toward the service spaces beneath the main house. The atmosphere changes with every step. The ceilings feel lower. The walls are less decorative. The floor is more practical beneath your feet. Heat gathers near the cooking areas where open fires and iron equipment turn food preparation into physically demanding work. This is where the elegance upstairs begins. Meals served in Jefferson's dining room did not appear because of clever architecture alone. They depended on skilled people. Many of those people were enslaved. Among the best known were members of the Hemings family, whose lives were deeply connected with Monticello for generations. One of them was James Hemings. You pause near the imagined hearth and consider his remarkable story. As a young enslaved man, James travelled with Jefferson to France in the 1780s. There, Jefferson arranged for him to train in French cooking. The training was extensive. James learned techniques used in professional kitchens, working with sauces, pastries, stocks, desserts, and other elements of French cuisine. When he returned to Virginia, he brought that knowledge back to Monticello. You can almost see the consequences around you. French methods meet Virginia ingredients. Imported tastes meet local harvests. European culinary ideas enter a plantation kitchen, where enslaved cooks adapt them to available foods, equipment, seasons, and household demands. The result is not simply French cooking transplanted unchanged. It becomes something particular to Monticello. You imagine copper vessels warming near the fire. An iron pot hangs over coals. Knives strike a wooden surface with a steady rhythm. Someone checks bread. Someone prepares vegetables. Someone turns attention toward a sauce that can be ruined by only a little neglect. Cooking here requires knowledge carried in the hands. Jefferson enjoyed foods he encountered abroad. He developed a taste for dishes, ingredients, and dining customs that reminded him of Europe. Macaroni fascinated him. So did olive oil. He appreciated fine wines, cheeses, and carefully prepared vegetables. Ice cream also appeared at Monticello, though making it required far more effort than the simplicity of the final dessert might suggest. You imagine the preparation. Ice must first exist in summer. That means winter ice has to be collected and stored in an icehouse, packed carefully enough to survive warmer months. Cream, sugar flavoring containers, and labor all come together later. The finished bowl may look effortless. The process is anything but. This is the pattern you have already seen in the architecture. The closer you look at comfort, the more labor appears behind it. Jefferson also took unusual interest in vegetables. For a wealthy Virginia planter of his era, he devoted remarkable attention to garden produce. Peas, beans, lettuces, cabbages, tomatoes, okra, squashes, and many other crops passed through his records and gardens. Some arrived from distant places. Others were already familiar in American kitchens. He liked variety. Dinner, therefore, offered another place where gardening experiments became tangible. A seed planted months earlier might eventually arrive on a plate. You move from the kitchen toward the dining room following the imagined path of a finished dish. The route is designed to minimize interruption. Food can pass through service spaces and revolving doors. Wine can rise by dumbwaiter. Guests remain surrounded by polished surfaces and conversation while much of the movement behind the meal remains outside their sight. You enter the dining room. The contrast is immediate. The heat of the kitchen fades. The table stands ready. Light from candles or windows rests on glassware and ceramics. Chairs wait at measured distances. Perhaps a fire burns nearby in cool weather. You imagine guests settling into their places. Jefferson generally preferred conversation at meals to elaborate ceremony. At Monticello, dinners could stretch comfortably while subjects changed from books and crops to travel, science, family, education, or public affairs. Yet every relaxed minute at the table extended someone else's work. Dishes had to arrive warm. Plates had to be removed. Glasses needed attention. Food had to be prepared in sequence. The kitchen continued moving while the dining room seemed still. You notice one of the revolving serving doors again. A dish appears. The panel turns. Then the opening closes. For the diner, it is clever. For the worker beyond the wall, it is simply one more part of the job. This hidden arrangement has sometimes encouraged romantic stories about Jefferson dining in complete privacy without servants present. The reality is harder to reconstruct so neatly. Devices reduced the need for people to enter the dining room constantly, but they did not eliminate service. Historical records do not preserve every meal or every movement around the table. Some evenings may have been more formal. Others may have involved family guests or servants in different ways. You let those uncertainties remain. Daily life rarely obeys one fixed fixed pattern. You return your attention to James Hemings. His story adds another important layer to the room. After returning from France, he eventually negotiated an arrangement with Jefferson that led to his freedom after training another cook to take his place. His brother Peter Hemings later became an important cook at Monticello. Their culinary skill became part of Jefferson's household reputation. Yet neither man chose the circumstances that first placed him in Jefferson's service. Skill and enslavement existed together. Achievement and coercion existed together. The kitchen cannot be understood by celebrating one and forgetting the other. You imagine the sound of a ladle against the rim of a pot. The room smells of onions, herbs, fat, smoke, and bread. Someone wipes moisture from a brow. Someone carries a dish toward the passage. The work is repetitive, skilled, and mostly invisible to the diners above. Food history often survives through menus, recipes, shopping records, garden notes, and household accounts. But many techniques were learned without being fully written down. A cook knows when a sauce looks right. A baker knows when dough feels ready. A person tending a fire learns heat through experience. Those forms of knowledge can disappear from written archives even when they shape meals every day. You therefore cannot reconstruct an ordinary Monticello dinner perfectly, Saul. You can identify ingredients. You can trace some recipes. You can identify certain cooks. but smells timing, gestures, corrections, and family variations mostly vanish. That absence makes the kitchen feel almost dreamlike. You can see enough to imagine it, but never enough to hear every voice. Dinner begins upstairs. A bottle rises. A door turns. A plate is placed on the till. Jefferson tastes food connected to gardens, trade routes, European travel, enslaved expertise in the agricultural world surrounding the mountain. One meal contains more history than it first appears to hold. And among all the things served here, one subject deserves its own journey. Wine. Jefferson studied it, purchased it, collected it, discussed it, transported it, stored it, and repeatedly dreamed of producing more of it in Virginia. You leave the dining room and follow another bottle downward. The air cools as you descend. Stone replaces polished wood. The light grows dimmer, and beneath the elegant rooms of Monticello, rows of bottles wait quietly in the cellar. Section 11. You descend from the dining room and follow the imagined bottle into the cooler spaces beneath Monticello. The air changes almost immediately. Stone and brick hold the night's chill. The scent of smoke from the kitchen fades, replaced by something earthier and more enclosed. You notice wood cork, damp masonry, and the faint sweetness that can cling to places where wine is stored. Above you, conversation continues around the table. Down here, the bottles wait in darkness. Jefferson's interest in wine began long before his retirement at Monticello, but his years in Europe transformed it into something closer to a serious study. While serving in France during the 1780s, he travelled through several wine-producing regions. He tasted, he compared, and took notes. He watched how vines were grown. He paid attention to prices, quality, transportation, and the reputation of different districts. For Jefferson, even drinking could become research. You imagine him travelling along a European road bordered by vineyards. Rows of vines follow hillsides. Stone farmhouses rest beneath the afternoon sun. The smell of dry soil and leaves mixes with dust from the road. To someone from Virginia, these landscapes offered more than pleasure. They suggested possibility. Perhaps wine of similar quality could someday be produced at home. That hope followed Jefferson across the Atlantic. Back at Monticello, the mountain became another experimental ground. He tried to encourage viticulture in Virginia and believed that suitable grapes might eventually succeed there. The dream was persistent. The results were disappointing. Jefferson planted vines and supported experiments, but the elegant wine culture he imagined never fully emerged on his plantation during his lifetime. Virginia's climate presented challenges. Humidity encouraged disease. Insects damaged vines. European grape varieties often struggled. Local conditions refused to behave like the landscapes Jefferson had admired abroad. You have seen this pattern before. A beautiful idea arrives at Monticello. Reality quietly edits it. Still, Jefferson kept trying. You step deeper into the cellar. The room feels especially appropriate for someone who liked order. Bottles could be grouped by origin or type. Records could note purchases and consumption. Wine could be brought upward when needed. The cellar connected directly with the dining room through the small dumbwaiters you notice beside the fireplace. You picture the process from below. Someone selects a bottle. Perhaps it has come from France, perhaps from Spain, Portugal, Italy, or another European region. The bottle is placed carefully on the small lift. A rope moves. The platform rises. Then the wine disappears through the ceiling toward the polished room above. From the dining table, the effect is elegant. From the cellar, it is mechanical. Someone still had to know which bottle Jefferson wanted. That knowledge mattered, and that mattered. Wine was not simply divided into red and white. Jefferson cared about origin, vintage, style, and quality. His correspondence and account books reveal frequent purchases and detailed opinions. He knew famous European regions and developed preferences among them. French wines occupied a large place in his taste, though he also appreciated bottles from elsewhere in Europe. Travel had trained his palate. It had also made that palate expensive. You imagine crates arriving after long journeys. A bottle crossing the Atlantic faced more danger than a book. Ships rolled. Temperatures changed. Corks failed. Glass broke. Wine spoiled. Importing it required money-reliable merchants, transportation, storage, and patience. The final glass served upstairs therefore carried a long chain of effort behind it. Jefferson sometimes sought wines directly through trusted contacts rather than relying entirely on middlemen. He valued authenticity and worried about quality. This desire to understand the source of things appears everywhere in his life. He wanted to know where a seed originated. I wanted the correct edition of a book. He wanted reliable measurements. And with wine, he wanted to know the vineyard district or producer behind the bottle whenever possible. You can almost see him turning a glass slowly beneath candlelight. Colour appears at the edge. The scent rises. Her tastes. Then another comparison begins in his mind. Yet Monticello was not simply a private tasting room. Wine also belonged to hospitality. Guests came frequently. Meals could last for hours. A good bottle helped create the atmosphere Jefferson valued at the table. Conversation mattered as much as consumption. Wine accompanied stories, arguments, memories, and long discussions among relatives and visitors. It softened the evening. But every bottle served to a guest also increased household expense. By Jefferson's later years, that mattered greatly. His debts were serious. He continued to live with habits formed during years of travel, public service, and elite social life, even as his finances became increasingly strained. Wine therefore becomes one of the quieter symbols of Monticello's contradiction. It represents refinement. It represents curiosity. It also represents cost. You walk past the imagined shelves and consider the vineyards outside. Jefferson wanted Virginia to produce excellent wine partly because he believed American agriculture could have become more diverse. He often disliked dependence on a narrow range of plantation crops, and experimented with grains, vegetables, fruit and other plants, searching for alternatives and improvements. Grapes belonged to that large agricultural vision. There was also a practical attraction. If good wine could be made locally, expensive imports would become less necessary. The idea sounds sensible. The vines disagreed. You picture workers tending them along the mountain. Pruning requires care. So does training the vine. Leaves must be watched. Fruit must be protected where possible. Weather must cooperate. And again, much of this work was performed by enslaved laborers. Jefferson could imagine the vineyard. Others had to dig, plant, carry, prune, maintain, and harvest. Even failed experiments required labor. That is easy to forget when reading only Jefferson's planting notes. A line in a garden record may describe a grape variety. Behind the line are hands in the soil. You step outside in your imagination. The afternoon sun has warmed the slope. Leaves move gently in the breeze. Vines stretch along a carefully planned area of the landscape, though. The exact appearance of Jefferson's vineyards changed over the years. Some plantings failed quickly. Others survived longer. Records describe intentions more clearly than they always reveal final results. Historians can reconstruct many of Jefferson's experiments, but not every vine's fate is known. There are gaps. Perhaps one planting struggled quietly for several seasons before disappearing. Perhaps another produced a small crop that never entered detailed records. The mountain keeps some of its agricultural history to itself. You return toward the cellar as evening settles again. A bottle is lifted upstairs. A cork is drawn. The small sound is almost lost beneath conversation. Jefferson's dream of a flourishing Virginia wine culture did not become reality at Monticello in the way he hoped. Yet the dream itself tells you something important. He rarely saw land as merely land. A hillside could become a vineyard. A garden bed could test a new vegetable. An orchard could contain varieties gathered from far away. A field could become an argument about the future of agriculture. The entire mountain was a laboratory. Wine led you downward into the cellar, but now it draws you back toward daylight. Beyond the house-long terraces follow the contour of the slope. Rows of vegetables wait in carefully divided beds. Fruit trees bloom or ripen according to the season. Seeds from distant places rest beneath Virginia soil. And somewhere among them, Jefferson is writing down another date. You leave the cool cellar behind. Warm air reaches you again. The garden lies ahead, stretching along the mountain like an enormous green notebook. Section 12. You step out from the cool cellar and into warm mountain light. The change feels almost immediate. Behind you are brick, stone, cork shadow, and bottles. Ahead the slope opens into green terraces, where leaves tremble in a mild Virginia breeze. The garden stretches along the mountain. It does not look like a simple kitchen patch. Jefferson imagined it as something closer to a living laboratory where food, curiosity, climate, and experiment could all meet in the same soil. You'll begin walking slowly along the long vegetable terrace. The ground falls away beyond its edge, opening wide views toward the surrounding countryside. The Blue Ridge Mountains rest in the distance, softened by haze. Here rows of crops once filled carefully divided beds. Peas, beans, lettuce, cabbages, turnips, squashes, tomatoes, melons, roots, herbs, and unfamiliar varieties gathered from many places also found their way into Jefferson's records. I was fascinated by diversity. A vegetable was not simply a vegetable if another variety might taste better, ripen earlier, survive heat more successfully, or produce longer through the season. So Jefferson kept trying things. You imagine him walking these rows in the morning. His shoes collect a little dust. Leaves brush softly against his clothing. The smell of warm earth rises from recently worked beds. Somewhere nearby insects hum around blossoms. He may stop to examine a plant whose seeds arrive through a friend, a traveler, or a merchant. Then he makes a note. Jefferson recorded planting dates with remarkable persistence. He noted when seeds went into the ground. He sometimes recorded when crops appeared, when they were harvested, and whether a variety succeeded or failed. The garden became another extension of his notebooks. Weather had columns of numbers, books had catalogues, the garden had dates. One unusual habit was Jefferson's informal competition over peas. He and neighbouring gardeners are remembered as comparing whose crop produced the earliest peas of the season. The winner enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of serving them first. It is a wonderfully small ambition for someone remembered for much larger matters. You picture a spring morning when someone bends over the vines looking for the first mature pods. There is no grand ceremony, only peas, yet this little contest reveals how intensely Jefferson noticed the seasonal life around him. The first asparagus mattered, the first peas mattered, the first frost mattered, the first bloom on a fruit tree could become another marker in the year. You continue down the terrace. The garden itself was large, extending hundreds of feet along the south-facing slope. Its position helped capture sunlight. The mountain also allowed Jefferson to take advantage of small differences in elevation and exposure. He paid attention to where certain plants performed best. The garden orchard, vineyard, and surrounding fields therefore became parts of one larger agricultural experiment. But Jefferson did not personally perform most of the physical labour required to sustain it. That work fell heavily upon enslaved people. They cleared beds, they carried manure, they dug soil, they planted, they weeded, they watered when possible, they harvested vegetables, they maintained fences and paths, they protected crops from animals and weather. The garden records often preserve Jefferson's choices more clearly than the daily experience of the people who carried those choices into practice. You pass beside an imagined row of beans. A notebook might record the planting date. It may not record the aching back of the person who planted them. That silence is part of the garden too. Jefferson's experiments depended on knowledge held by enslaved gardeners and agricultural workers, including experience with soils, weather, local plants, and cultivation methods. Some knowledge may also have travelled through African and African-American food traditions. Okra is one example of a crop strongly connected with African foodways in the Americas. Other plants and cooking practices carried similar stories of movement, adaptation, and survival. The vegetable garden, therefore, gathered more than seeds from different regions. It gathered different traditions of knowledge. Not all of those traditions were credited equally. You keep walking. Near the vegetable terrace, fruit trees formed another area of experimentation. Jefferson cultivated peaches, apples, cherries, pears, figs, and other fruits. Some varieties were familiar throughout Virginia. Others were selected because he had encountered them elsewhere or received them through correspondence. Orchards required patience. A lettuce might reward you within weeks. A tree required years. That difference suited Jefferson's restless mind less easily. You can imagine him planting something that would not mature quickly enough to satisfy curiosity. Still he planted. Some trees survived. Others failed. Cold snaps damaged tender varieties. Disease arrived. Insects fed on leaves and fruit. The mountain repeatedly reminded him that agricultural plans could not be controlled with architectural precision. A wall remained where you placed it. A tree had opinions of its own. You smiled gently at the thought. Jefferson didn't stop experimenting. He continued introducing new varieties, testing their performance and comparing results. Some of his gardening notes are so detailed that modern historians have been able to reconstruct portions of his planting schemes. Yet uncertainty remains. Seeds were exchanged under names that changed over time. Old plant names do not always correspond neatly to modern varieties. A vegetable Jefferson called by one name may be difficult to identify precisely today. Some cultivars disappeared entirely. Others survive only through related form. The garden you imagine is therefore both carefully documented and partly lost. That makes it feel almost dreamlike. You can recreate the rows, you can identify many crops, but you cannot taste every tomato Jefferson tasted, or know exactly how each melon smelled when cut open on a summer afternoon. Those sensations vanished. You move toward the garden pavilion. Its small structure looks outward over the slope. From here the view widens. Jefferson could sit, read, write, or simply look across the cultivated beds toward the distant landscape. The placement says something about how he saw gardening. Food production and beauty did not need to remain separate. A vegetable garden could also be a place for contemplation. You sit there in your imagination. The wooden seat feels warm from the sun. A light breeze reaches the pavilion. Far below the land stretches into softened greens and browns. Closer by leaves rustle. A worker crosses between rows carrying tools. Another figure bends beside the soil. The scene is peaceful from a distance. Up close it is full of labour. That double perspective follows you throughout Monticello. The garden is beautiful. It is also worked. It expresses Jefferson's curiosity. It also expresses the unequal system that gave him time to pursue that curiosity. Both remain visible when you choose to look carefully. As afternoon settles, the vegetable beds begin to glow under lower sunlight. Leaves cast longer shadows. The smell of crushed herbs rises where someone has brushed against them. A basket of produce may soon travel toward the kitchen. Some of it will become dinner. Some seeds may be saved. A failed crop may earn a note. A successful one may be planted again next year. The garden turns slowly with the seasons. And beyond these green terraces lies another landscape where the hidden machinery of Monticello becomes harder to overlook. Workshops stand there. Cabins once stood there. Smoke rises from fires used for trades and manufacture. Children, craftsmen, domestic workers and families move through a narrow settlement close to Jefferson's elegant house. You leave the pavilion and follow the path toward Mulberry Row. The garden has shown you how Monticello experimented with plants. Now you're about to see more clearly the people whose labour kept those experiments and the entire mountain alive. Section 13. You leave the vegetable terrace behind and follow the path toward the narrow working landscape known as Mulberry Row. The atmosphere changes gradually. The garden had offered long views, ordered beds and the soft rustle of leaves. Here the sounds become more practical. A hammer strikes metal. Wood scrapes against wood. A fire breathes inside a workshop. Someone carries a basket along the path. Children move between buildings while adults continue the work of the day. You are still close to Jefferson's elegant house. Yet this is another Monticello. Mulberry Row stretched along a narrow lane near the main residence and became one of the most important working areas on the mountain top. Over the years, different buildings stood here. There were workshops, storage spaces, small dwellings, places for textile work, areas connected with metal working, carpentry and other skilled trades. The exact arrangement changed as Monticello changed. Buildings appeared, others disappeared. Some were rebuilt for new purposes. So as you walk, you should imagine a landscape in motion rather than one permanent village frozen in time. The ground beneath you is packed from repeated footsteps. Dust rises lightly in dry weather. After rain, the same path can become soft and muddy. Smoke from a chimney drifts through the air. The smell of charcoal mixes with cut wood animals, cooking fires, leather and earth. This was not the quiet background of Monticello. It was part of its engine. Many of the people working here were enslaved. They were not simply anonymous labourers. They were blacksmiths, carpenters, nail makers, textile workers, domestic servants, farm labourers, wagoners, gardeners and craftspeople. Some had years of specialised experience. Some learned trades while still young. Their work required judgment, memory, coordination and skill. You pass near an imagined workshop. Inside iron glows near a forge. The air is hotter here. A worker lifts a tool, adjusts the metal and returns it to the heat. The movements are practiced. Nothing about them is accidental. A useful object must be shaped correctly. A hinge must fit. A tool must survive repeated use. A piece of equipment repaired badly may fail later in the field. Skilled work carries responsibility. Nearby, another building might contain woodworking. You smell fresh shavings before you reach the doorway. Boards must be measured. Edges must be shaped. Some must be shaped. Joints must fit. Jefferson's architectural ideas required this kind of practical knowledge. Drawings alone could not make Monticello. Someone had to understand how wood behaved under a tool. Someone had to know where a structure needed support. Someone had to correct a mistake when measurements on paper met an imperfect piece of timber. The finished house often preserved Jefferson's ideas more visibly than the expertise of the people who built them. Here on Mulberry Row, that imbalance becomes easier to recognize. You continue walking. One of the most unusual operations connected with this area was nail making. Jefferson established a nail-making enterprise at Monticello during the 1790s. Boys, many of them enslaved, worked producing nails from iron rods. The task sounds simple until you imagine repeating it hour after hour. Metal must be cut, heated, hammered, pointed, headed. Then another nail begins, and another. The sound becomes rhythmic. Tap, strike, turn, strike again. Nails were useful because almost every building needed them. They could also be sold, giving Jefferson another source of income. For the boys assigned to the work, however, the nailery was not a charming experiment in early industry. It was compulsory labour. Their time and production were controlled by someone else. You listen to the hammering differently once you understand that. The sound still carries skill, but it also carries inequality. The same is true across Mulberry Row. Families lived close to work. Parents worried about children. Children learned tasks by watching older people. Food was prepared. Clothing was repaired. Stories were shared. People formed friendships and family ties within conditions they had not chosen. The word enslaved describes a legal condition, but it does not describe an entire human life. You remind yourself of that as you walk. People here laughed. They argued. They worried. They remembered relatives. They developed skills. They cared for children. They made decisions whenever choices were available. They created lives within severe limits imposed upon them. Some of those families were connected across generations. The Hemings family was among the best documented at Monticello, but many other families also lived and worked on Jefferson's properties. Names appear in records. So do occupations. Sometimes ages appear. Sometimes family relationships can be reconstructed. But the written record is uneven. Jefferson recorded people primarily because he considered them part of his property and labor system. That means his documents often tell you what he wanted to know, rather than what they would have chosen to tell you about themselves. A record may list a person's work assignment. It may say nothing about what that person hoped for. A name may survive, a voice may not. This is one of the deepest uncertainties on Mulberry Row. Archaeology can help. Foundations reveal where buildings stood. Fragments of ceramics suggest what people used. Buttons, nails, tools, glass, animal bones, and household objects offer small clues about daily routines. Soil itself can preserve traces of ordinary life. Yet even thousands of objects cannot fully reconstruct a conversation that took place beside a doorway 200 years ago. You stop near the location of a small dwelling. Imagine evening approaching. Work is ending for some people, though. Domestic duties continue. A fire burns low. Food is being prepared. Someone mends clothing beside fading light. A child leans against an adult. The main house stands nearby, much larger and more comfortable, its windows catching the sunset. The distance between the buildings is short. The distance between the lives inside them is enormous. Jefferson could retreat to his books. An enslaved worker could not decide freely to leave Monticello. Jefferson could experiment with architecture. The people who constructed it remained legally owned. Jefferson wrote about liberty. The plantation around him depended upon slavery. You do not need to force these contradictions into something dramatic. The quiet facts are powerful enough. You continue down the row. Perhaps you hear spinning or weaving from another work area. Textiles were part of the plantation economy, especially during periods when Jefferson tried to increase household production. Wool and other fibers had to be processed through many stages before cloth became usable. Again, a finished object hides a chain of labor. A coat begins far from the coat. A meal begins far from the table. A house begins far from the drawing. Monticello repeatedly teaches you to follow things backward. When you do, people appear. The workers of Mulberry Row were not hidden from Jefferson. I knew this landscape well. But later generations often visited Monticello primarily to see the house, the dome, the books, and Jefferson's inventions. The working community beside the mansion received far less attention. That has changed as historians and archaeologists have worked to recover the lives of enslaved families more fully. Still, much remains incomplete. You cannot restore every building. You cannot identify every person who crossed this path. Some stories survive only in fragments. You walk among those fragments now. The sun has moved lower. Workshop sounds begin to soften. Smoke hangs briefly in the warm air before drifting toward the trees. Behind you, the main house glows in late light. Ahead, another set of records waits. Jefferson wrote down names, ages, work assignments, births, and family relationships with unsettling precision. Those pages preserve a people while also revealing the system that treated them as property. And as you leave Mulberry Row, you begin moving from the physical landscape of slavery into the cold columns of ink, where human lives were measured, counted, and recorded. Section 14. You leave Mulberry Row as the last workshop sounds soften behind you. The hammering fades first, then the scrape of tools, then the ordinary murmur of people moving between work, food, family, and evening tasks becomes harder to distinguish from the wind passing through the trees. Ahead, Monticello's brick walls catch the low sunlight. But instead of returning immediately to the polished rooms, you follow another path into Jefferson's world. This path is made of paper. You find yourself looking over pages filled with names, numbers, ages, worker assignments, births, marriages, purchases, and calculations. The handwriting is orderly. The meaning is not. Jefferson kept a similar record about the people he enslaved. In farm books and other documents, he recorded individuals and families living across Monticello and his other properties. These records are among the reasons historians can reconstruct so many names connected with the plantation today. Yet the very survival of that information creates an uncomfortable contradiction. The records preserve human lives because Jefferson was keeping track of people whom the law allowed him to own. You look down at one imagined page. A name appears beside an age. Another line records a child. Another identifies a work assignment. A family can sometimes be followed across decades through these entries. For historians, such details are extraordinarily valuable. For the people being recorded, however, the page represented something very different. They did not choose to enter the ledger. I begin slowly with the names. Naming matters because slavery has often been remembered through numbers. Hundreds enslaved, dozens working here, several families living there. Numbers help describe scale, but they can also flatten people. Jefferson's records sometimes allow that flattening to be reversed. One person becomes a blacksmith, another becomes a cook, another becomes a gardener, carpenter, domestic worker, wagoner, or textile worker. Children appear alongside parents. Brothers and sisters emerge. Extended family networks begin to take shape. You realize that Monticello was not populated by a temporary collection of unrelated workers. Many people belonged to families with deep connections to the mountain. Some lived there for much of their lives. Some had parents and grandparents who had also been enslaved within Jefferson's extended household. Children grew up surrounded by relatives. Marriage could link families living on different farms. A visit between relatives might require walking considerable distances after the workday had ended. Family life continued despite a system that could disrupt it at any moment. That possibility hangs quietly over the records. An owner could sell a person. Debt could force a sale. Inheritance could divide property. A husband might belong legally to one owner while his wife belonged to another. Children could face futures different from their parents. The stability of family life therefore depended upon decisions often made by people outside the family itself. You turn another page. Jefferson sometimes recorded births with remarkable attention. To a historian, a birth entry can establish relationships and approximate ages. To Jefferson, it could also represent an increase in the population he regarded as property. The same line can therefore be read in two profoundly different ways. A baby has entered a family. A human being has also entered an economic ledger. That is one of the hardest things these documents reveal. Slavery did not exist only in moments of obvious cruelty. It was built into ordinary administration. Ink, columns, lists, calculations. Daily management could make human ownership look routine. You sit with that quietness for a moment. The absence of dramatic language makes the record more disturbing, not less. A person's life can appear beside livestock, crops, tools, or financial information because the plantation system translated people into property. Yet human life constantly exceeds the categories imposed upon it. A work assignment cannot tell you what someone thought while performing it. An age does not tell you what frightened a child. A family list does not reveal a private joke shared at supper. A notation about illness may tell you nothing about who sat nearby through the night. The ledger gives you structure. It rarely gives you the full interior life. So historians search elsewhere. They examine letters. They study archaeology. They compare legal documents. They read the recollections of descendants. They trace family histories forward beyond Monticello. They look for the places where one type of evidence can illuminate another. Slowly fragments become people again. Some details are especially valuable because they reveal skill. Enslaved people at Monticello performed highly specialized work. Blacksmithing required long practice. Carpentry demanded measurement and judgment. Cooking involved knowledge that could not be reduced to a recipe. Gardening required experience with soil, weather, insects, and seasons. Domestic work demanded intimate knowledge of household routines. These were not interchangeable tasks. Jefferson's records sometimes acknowledged specialization because he depended upon it. But skill did not create freedom. An exceptionally capable artisan could still be sold. A talented cook could still be legally owned. Expertise might sometimes provide limited bargaining power or additional mobility, but it existed inside boundaries determined by slavery. You think again of James Hemings, who trained in French cuisine. His extraordinary skill did not erase the fact that Jefferson claimed ownership over him before his eventual emancipation. That pattern repeats in quieter forms across the plantation. Talent and coercion coexist. You turn toward another group almost hidden by the nature of the documents. Children. Many enslaved children began contributing labor at relatively young ages. Tasks changed as they grew. Younger children might assist with lighter work before being assigned increasingly demanding responsibilities. Some boys entered the nailery, others learned trades. Girls might be assigned to domestic, textile, agricultural, or household labor. But official records tend to describe what children produced more readily than how childhood felt. You imagine them beyond the page, running briefly between buildings, watching adults work, learning family stories, being corrected, playing when opportunity allowed, growing taller beside the same mountain paths. Their lives contained ordinary childhood moments, even within conditions no child had chosen. And here uncertainty becomes especially important. The records cannot tell you exactly how much freedom children found between required tasks. They cannot recover every game. They rarely preserve the names children used privately for relatives. They cannot tell you which stories were repeated around evening fires. Much of this world survives through inference and descendant testimony rather than Jefferson's administrative notes. You let the missing pieces remain missing. Respecting history sometimes means refusing to invent what the evidence cannot provide. Outside daylight fades further. The ink on the imagined page seems darker. You notice how Jefferson's careful recording habits, which have followed you through weather gardening books and correspondence, take on a different meaning here. When he measured temperature, the numbers described air. When he listed vegetables, the entries described plants. When he catalogued books, the titles described possessions. But when he listed enslaved people, the habit of classification reached human beings. That difference matters. It is tempting to praise Jefferson's precision because it helps modern historians. Yet the purpose of the record belonged to the plantation system of his own time. You can value the information without forgetting why it was created. That balance becomes essential as your journey continues, because among the families appearing within Jefferson's records, one has drawn more attention than almost any other. The Hemings family lived close to the centre of Monticello's household. Their history touches cooking, domestic service, craftsmanship, kinship, freedom, and enslavement. And within that family was Sally Hemings. Her relationship with Jefferson has been surrounded for generations by denial speculation, family testimony, documentary evidence, and changing historical interpretation. You close the ledger gently. The next part of the story requires particular care, not because it needs mystery, but because behind one of America's most discussed historical relationships was a woman living within a system that denied her legal freedom. You leave the cold columns of the record behind and begin looking for the person they could never fully contain. Section 15. You leave the ledger behind and step into one of the quietest, most complicated parts of Monticello's story. The mountain is almost still now. Evening light rests against the brick walls. Trees beyond the house have turned into dark shapes against a fading sky, and the air carries the soft scent of grass, cooling earth, and distant wood smoke. Somewhere within this landscape lived Sally Hemings. Her name has become inseparable from Jefferson's. Yet if you approach her carefully, you quickly discover how much of her life survives only through fragments. She was born in 1773 into the Hemings family, one of the most extensively documented enslaved families associated with Monticello. Her mother was Elizabeth Hemings. Through her mother, Sally belonged to a large network of siblings, half-siblings, nieces, nephews, and other relatives whose lives were deeply woven into Jefferson's household and plantations. That family connection matters. Sally Hemings was not an isolated figure entering Jefferson's life from nowhere. She grew up within a community. She had brothers and sisters with specialized roles. James Hemings became the French-trained cook you encountered earlier. John Hemings became a highly skilled woodworker and joiner. Other members of the family worked in domestic service, textile production, cooking, and other areas of plantation life. You imagine Sally first not as the subject of a historical controversy, but as a child among relatives. She hears familiar voices. She learns the rhythms of the household. She moves between spaces defined by slavery, but also shaped by family relationships that Jefferson's records can only partly reveal. When Sally was still a teenager, her life changed dramatically. In 1787, she traveled to Europe in connection with Jefferson's household, eventually joining him in Paris. You imagine the journey. Virginia disappears behind a ship. The Atlantic stretches outward for weeks. Wood creaks beneath changing weather. Salt gathers in the air. Then Europe appears. For a young enslaved woman from Virginia, Paris must have felt extraordinarily distant from Monticello. The street sounded different. People spoke another language. Buildings rose in unfamiliar form. Carriages moved across stone. Markets carried new smells. Clothing, food customs, and social life all announced that she had entered another world. But France also created an unusual legal situation. Slavery did not operate there under the same legal conditions as in Virginia. Historians have concluded that Sally may have had a possible path to claim freedom while in France. Exactly how fully she understood those legal possibilities cannot be known with certainty. That uncertainty is important. You should not imagine thoughts for which no evidence survives. What is better documented is that Sally eventually returned to Virginia with Jefferson. According to the later recollections of her son Madison Hemings, she agreed to return after Jefferson promised her certain privileges and freedom for her children when they reached adulthood. You sit with that detail carefully. It is one of the most important pieces of testimony connected with her life, but it was recorded decades later through her son. Historians therefore compare it with other evidence rather than treating any single source as complete. The documentary record supports important parts of the account. Sally's surviving children did in fact eventually receive freedom or were allowed to leave slavery as they grew older. Her relationship with Jefferson also fits a pattern visible in Monticello's records. Today, the historical consensus is that Thomas Jefferson fathered Sally Hemings' children. That conclusion rests on several kinds of evidence considered together. There is DNA evidence connecting the Jefferson male line to descendants of Eston Hemings. There are Jefferson's detailed travel records. There are records of Sally Hemings' children being born during periods when Jefferson was present at Monticello. There is Madison Hemings' testimony. There are also later family traditions from both black and white descendants. No single piece tells the entire story. Together, they create a strong historical case. You pause because this is where older versions of the story often went wrong. For many years, the possibility that Jefferson fathered Sally's children was dismissed or treated as scandalous gossip. Later research changed that understanding, but replacing denial with romantic language creates another distortion. Sally Hemings was enslaved. Jefferson legally controlled her status, her labor, and much of the future available to her and her children. I was also more than 30 years older than she was. Those facts created an enormous balance of power. For that reason, describing their relationship as an ordinary romance would hide the conditions under which it existed. The surviving evidence does not allow you to know Sally's private emotions toward Jefferson. You do not know how she understood the relationship from day to day. You cannot recover private conversations between them. You cannot know whether moments later remembered as negotiation felt to her like genuine choice, constrained choice, survival, calculation, affection, fear, or some combination impossible to reconstruct now. History has limits here. You respect them. Sally herself left no known written memoir. Most descriptions of her come through other people. One later account described her as light-skinned and attractive, but even such descriptions passed through the perceptions of observers and memory. Her own voice remains largely absent. That absence becomes especially noticeable inside Monticello, where Jefferson's voice survives everywhere. His letters remain. His measurements remain. His architectural drawings remain. His garden records remain. His book lists remain. Sally's thoughts do not survive in anything comparable. You walk slowly through the rooms and feel that imbalance. A man with extraordinary access to paper left thousands of pages. A woman he enslaved left almost none. Yet her life still altered the history of this house. Sally Hemings had several children associated with Jefferson, though not all survived infancy. 4 reached adulthood: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. Their later lives followed different paths. Beverly and Harriet left Monticello as young adults and entered white society. Madison and Eston were later freed through Jefferson's will. The details are unusual and revealing. Some of Sally's children were light enough in complexion to live socially as white. This meant that the boundaries of race which slavery treated as rigid could become far more complicated in lived experience. Families could cross those boundaries in ways records only partially captured. You imagine the strange emotional complexity this may have created within the Hemings family. One relative remains publicly identified as black, another leaves and becomes known as white. A shared childhood can disappear into 2 different social identities. What did relatives say before such departures? Did they expect to meet again? Did they preserve contact quietly? Some evidence suggests family connections continued in certain cases, but many private details remain unknown. Again, the silences are part of the story. Sally Hemings herself was never formally emancipated in Jefferson's will. After Jefferson's death in 1826, she was instead allowed to live freely in Charlottesville by Jefferson's daughter Martha Randolph. This arrangement is as often described as giving Sally her time, meaning she was permitted to live as though free without a formal emancipation document. She spent her final years near her sons Madison and Eston. You picture her away from the mountain. Monticello remains visible in memory, perhaps even physically in the distance. She has spent much of her life connected to that household. Now the rhythms are different. No guest bells, no endless construction, no Jefferson moving through the cabinet. She lives until 18 through. What she thought about those final years is unknown. You cannot ask her whether leaving the mountain felt like relief. You cannot ask how she remembered Paris. You cannot ask what she told her children privately about Jefferson. You can only follow the surviving traces. That is enough. You do not need to turn Sally Hemings into a mystery designed to shock. Her actual history is more meaningful than that. She lived within one of the most famous households in the early United States while possessing far less control over her life than the man whose name dominates its story. She crossed an ocean, so became part of a complicated negotiation over the future of her children. Her descendants carried memories that later helped historians reconsider Monticello itself. And when you now walk through these rooms, you no longer see Jefferson alone. You see overlapping families, different degrees of freedom, different childhoods, different futures beginning beneath the same roof and on the same mountain. As night settles around Monticello, you follow those children next. Some grow up as Jefferson's acknowledged grandchildren. Others grow up enslaved while also being his children. They play, learn, work, watch adults and slowly discover that the mountain offers very different futures depending on where society has placed them. The distance between those childhoods is sometimes only a doorway. Section 16. You remain on the mountain as night settles more deeply around Monticello. The rooms are quieter now, but childhood does not disappear simply because the adults have gone to bed. Somewhere in the house, a child may still be whispering. Elsewhere beyond the polished rooms, another child may be finishing a task before sleep. They live close to one another. They breathe the same Virginia air. They watch the same storms move across the Blue Ridge. Yet the futures waiting for them are very different. Monticello was filled with children. Jefferson's own daughters grew up within his household, and later, his grandchildren brought a new generation into the house. At the same time, many enslaved children were born into families living on the plantation. Their lives overlapped geographically. They sometimes moved through the same spaces, but law, race, family status, and slavery separated their possibilities from the beginning. You imagine an early morning. Sunlight enters the house slowly. A white child in Jefferson's family may begin the day with lessons, reading, music, or correspondence. Education mattered greatly to Jefferson. He believed strongly in structured learning and took a close interest in the education of younger relatives. Books were everywhere. Languages, history, mathematics, music, geography, and drawing could all become part of a cultivated childhood. A child raised inside Monticello grew up surrounded by intellectual objects. Maps hung on walls. Scientific instruments sat nearby. Guests discussed distant places. Books opened pathways into worlds far beyond Virginia. You can imagine how extraordinary that environment might feel. A curious child could ask what an object was and receive an answer that began in France, ancient Rome, Western North America, or somewhere across the Atlantic. But childhood at Monticello was not entirely formal. Jefferson's grandchildren remembered a grandfather who could be affectionate and playful. He enjoyed having younger family members near him, and the house became increasingly crowded with relatives during his later years. Children moved through rooms that had originally been designed around Jefferson's own carefully ordered routines. The result was less controlled than his architecture suggested. Small feet crossed floors, doors opened unexpectedly. Books were touched. Questions interrupted reading. The perfectly arranged private retreat became a family home. You can almost smile at the contrast. Jefferson designed narrow staircases to save space only to fill the house with people. He created quiet rooms for concentration, then surrounded himself with grandchildren. The mountain that had promised isolation became crowded with family life. You move outside. The grass feels cooler beneath the evening air. Not far away, enslaved children are also growing up. Their childhood begins under entirely different conditions. They are legally enslaved from birth. Their labor movement and future can be controlled by the people who claim ownership over them. At young ages, many begin contributing to plantation work. The tasks may start small: carrying water, watching younger children, helping with household chores, assisting in gardens, gathering materials, running messages. As they grow older, assignments become more demanding. Some boys enter trades, others work in fields. Girls may be assigned to domestic service, textile work, agriculture, or other labor. You think again of the nailery. Young enslaved boys were among those put to work making nails for Jefferson's commercial enterprise. The repeated hammering you heard earlier takes on another meaning when you remember how young some of the workers were. Their days could be measured by production. More nails meant greater value to the enterprise. A child's hands became part of an accounting system. Yet even under these conditions, childhood did not vanish completely. Children found moments between obligation. They learned from older relatives. They heard stories. They watched skilled adults work. They explored paths familiar to their families. They may have played with improvised objects, chased one another outdoors, or turned ordinary materials into games. Exactly what those games were is often difficult to know. This is one of the areas where the historical record becomes thin. Jefferson wrote much more about labor than play. Plantation records preserve assignments better than jokes. They preserve output better than imagination. Archaeology can sometimes reveal toys or objects that may have belonged to children, but interpretation remains careful. A small object might have been used in several ways. A fragment of daily life does not always explain itself. You allow the uncertainty to remain. Children do not need to leave detailed written records in order to have experienced wonder. You walk farther along the mountain. Family networks mattered enormously for enslaved children. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, older siblings and cousins could provide care, teaching emotional support and continuity. Knowledge passed through families. A child might learn how to tend a fire, prepare food, repair clothing. recognize plants, handle tools, care for younger children, or navigate relationships within the plantation. Some knowledge was practical, some was cultural, some may have carried memories of people and places no longer physically present. Slavery constantly threatened these networks through sale and separation. That threat meant family relationships carried additional importance. You imagine a mother watching a child grow taller. She knows the child will eventually receive heavier work. She may also know that ownership decisions could change the family's future without warning. Those worries rarely appear clearly in Jefferson's ledgers, but they belong to the emotional landscape of the plantation. And then there were Sally Hemings's children. Their position was especially complicated. Beverly, Harriet Madison, and Eston Hemings grew up enslaved at Monticello, while according to the strong historical evidence you have already encountered also being Jefferson's children. That fact creates one of the most striking contrasts on the mountain. Jefferson's white grandchildren could live in the main household as a recognized family. His children with Sally Hemings remained legally enslaved. They shared ancestry with people living in the mansion, but occupied a completely different legal world. You picture children crossing the same grounds without the social system around them, acknowledging the connection in equal ways. The contradiction is difficult to miss. Some of Sally's sons learned skilled trades. Madison and Eston Hemings became associated with woodworking, and Eston later became a professional musician after leaving Monticello. Their lives remind you that children raised under slavery were not defined by the labor assignments imposed upon them. They developed talents. They formed identities. They carried family histories into adulthood. Beverly and Harriet eventually left Monticello and entered white society. Their departures were unusual. Jefferson did not publicly recall formal emancipation for them in the same manner later used for Madison and Eston. Instead, they were permitted to leave. The precise emotional circumstances surrounding those departures are difficult to reconstruct. You do not know exactly what was said before they went. You do not know how Sally felt watching them leave. You do not know whether everyone expected permanent separation. The records give outcomes more easily than conversations. You return toward the main house. A window glows softly against the darkness. Inside, one of Jefferson's grandchildren may be reading. Outside, another child may be walking back toward a family dwelling. Both children have spent the day beneath the same mountain sky. One grows up expecting inheritance, education, and legal freedom. The other grows up knowing freedom depends upon decisions made by someone else. Monticello's childhoods existed side by side. That is what makes them so revealing. You do not need grand political arguments to understand the difference. You only need to imagine two children waking on the same morning. One may ask what lesson comes next. The other may be told what work comes next. And still both notice rain against the roof. Both know the smell of wood smoke. Both recognize the sound of the great clock. Both watch visitors arriving along the mountain road. Those visitors are becoming more numerous now. Jefferson's reputation has made Monticello a destination. Relatives arrive. Travelers arrive. Admirers arrive. Some come invited. Others simply appear. And as the house fills with guests, every bedroom, kitchen, passage, and working hand must adjust once again. Section 17. You remain near the main house as another carriage begins climbing the mountain road. At first you hear only a faint rattle. Then comes the soft rhythm of hooves, the creak of wheels, and the occasional call of someone guiding horses around a bend. Monticello is about to receive more guests. Again, for Jefferson, retirement did not bring the solitude he may have imagined. His fame had made the mountain attractive to travelers. Former colleagues came, foreign visitors came, neighbors came, political admirers came, curious strangers came. Some had invitations, others did not. You picture Jefferson watching another arrival from one of the windows. Perhaps he recognizes the carriage. Perhaps he does not. Either way, the household must respond. A visitor needs to be welcomed. Horses require care. Luggage must be carried. A room must be found. Food must be prepared. And if the visitors stay longer than expected, the entire rhythm of Monticello shifts around them. The elegant house you have explored was never especially large for the number of people it sometimes contained. Jefferson had designed clever spaces, compact stairways, alcove beds and rooms carefully fitted around particular functions. But architecture could not easily solve the problem of too many human beings. His family alone filled much of the house during his later years. His daughter Martha Randolph spent extended periods at Monticello with her children. Grandchildren moved through bedrooms and corridors. Relatives came and went. Then guests were added on top of them. The mountain retreat began to resemble an unusually busy inn. You imagine arriving as a traveller after a difficult journey. The road has been dusty. Your clothes carry the smell of horses and warm leather. Then Monticello appears near the summit with its dome rising over the trees. You have heard of Jefferson for years. Now you may actually meet him. For many visitors, the experience carried a sense of pilgrimage. Jefferson had been a diplomat, secretary of state, vice president, and president. By the time he was an old man, he had become one of the most famous figures in the young United States. People wanted to see where he lived. They wanted to see his books. They wanted to look at his inventions. They wanted to speak with him. Some even wanted small objects connected to him. That attention could become exhausting. Jefferson complained privately about the burden of visitors, who valued hospitality and continued receiving people, but the constant stream consumed time, food, space, and money. You can understand the problem easily. One guest is pleasant, 10 guests become logistics, and when visitors remain for several days, hospitality becomes an entire system. You follow an arriving trunk into the house. Where will it go? A guest room may already be occupied. Another relative may have to move. Children may share spaces. Temporary sleeping arrangements can appear wherever there is room. The dome room, beautiful but awkward, may occasionally become useful simply because another bed is needed. Monticello's carefully planned architecture becomes flexible under pressure. Even Jefferson's private time shrinks. A visitor may want a tour. Another wants conversation. Someone brings a letter of introduction. Someone has questions about farming. Another wants to discuss politics or education. A young admirer may simply want to say that he has met Thomas Jefferson. You picture Jefferson smiling politely, then perhaps glancing toward the papers waiting in his cabinet. The correspondence has not disappeared. The weather still needs recording. The garden still produces question. Monticello's finances still require attention. Yet the guest is here now, so the day changes. The dining room becomes especially important. Meals are one of the easiest ways to understand the strain created by constant hospitality. An additional person requires food. Several additional people require much more. The kitchen must adjust portions. Bread must be baked. Vegetables gathered. Meat prepared. Wine opened. Plates washed. Rooms cleaned. Beds made. Linens changed. Water carried. Fires maintained. Behind every visitor stood additional labor, much of it performed by enslaved people. This is where Jefferson's generosity as a host cannot be separated from the plantation system sustaining it. A guest might remember a wonderful dinner. The cook remembers the preparation. A visitor may admire a comfortable room. Someone else carried the water and cleaned it. Hospitality appears graceful because the work behind it is distributed elsewhere. You return to the dining room in your imagination. The table is crowded tonight. Candles throw warm light across faces. Jefferson sits among relatives and travelers. Conversation moves slowly from one subject to another. Someone asks about France. Someone else asks about the University of Virginia, which occupied much of Jefferson's attention late in life. A guest notices the revolving serving door. Another looks toward the small dumbwaiter near the fireplace. Perhaps Jefferson explains the mechanism with quiet satisfaction. For a moment, Monticello becomes exactly what he liked it to be, a place of ideas. But beyond the walls, the household continues working. You hear the quiet rotation of a serving door. A plate disappears. Another arrives. Someone below selects another bottle. The machinery of hospitality never stops simply because the conversation is pleasant. Guests also brought news. This made their presence valuable. In an age before rapid communication, travelers carried information in their memories. They had recently seen cities Jefferson no longer visited. They knew people he had not spoken with directly. They could describe elections, universities, new inventions, changing fashions, crops, books, and events in distant states. A visitor therefore functioned almost like a moving newspaper. You imagine Jefferson listening closely, his curiosity competes with his desire for solitude. That tension explains much about his later life. He wanted the world to come to him, just perhaps not quite so often. There was also an unusual social mixture at Monticello. Foreign guests might sit near Virginia relatives. Scientists might meet farmers. Old political associates could encounter young students. Grandchildren moved around famous visitors who seemed ordinary because they were simply at the family table. For the children, history sometimes arrived before supper. Not every visitor left reliable descriptions. Some wrote journals or letters afterward. Others preserved memories decades later. These accounts provide valuable glimpses of Jefferson in retirement, but they can conflict. One guest remembers informality. Another emphasizes dignity. One recalls a room in a particular way. Another remembers a different arrangement. Memory reshapes places. People also see what they expect to see. A traveler who admired Jefferson may interpret everything generously. A critic may notice different details. So historians compare these recollections with household records, architecture, correspondence, and other evidence. You let the contradictions remain. Perhaps that is appropriate for a house filled with so many different observers. Outside, another evening passes. Some visitors prepare to leave in the morning. Their horses will be brought forward. Luggage will return to the carriage. Jefferson may stand near the house and offer a final farewell. Then wheels begin descending the road. Dust rises. Silence returns. For a few minutes, perhaps the mountain feels peaceful again. Then another rider appears below. You can almost hear Jefferson's private resignation. Hospitality had a financial cost as well. Food, wine, servants, horses, repairs, clothing, construction, family expenses, and entertainment all accumulated. Jefferson's lifestyle remained expensive even as his debts grew. The more famous Monticello became, the more people came to see it. And the more visitors arrived, the more costly the household became to maintain. The beautiful mountain retreat was becoming economically fragile. You stand near the front door after the latest guests disappear. The great clock continues ticking. The garden continues growing. The books remain on their shelves. Nothing appears immediately wrong. But behind the graceful rooms are accounts that no clever mechanism can hide. Bills gather. Loans remain. Land does not produce enough income. Hospitality continues. Construction has consumed money for decades. Jefferson has spent much of his life designing systems to make Monticello work smoothly. Now late in life, one system refuses to cooperate. His finances. You leave the guest rooms behind and follow the paper trail toward debts, expenses, and the uncomfortable arithmetic beneath the beauty of the mountain. Section 2. You leave the guest rooms behind and follow the quieter trail that runs beneath almost every part of Monticello. It is not made of brick or timber. It is made of numbers, bills, loans, accounts, unpaid balances. The mountain still looks beautiful. Morning light still reaches the dome. The gardens still follow the slope. Books remain on shelves, and the great clock continues measuring the hours as if nothing has changed. But Jefferson's finances have been weakening for years. You'll begin with the house itself. Monticello was expensive because Jefferson never treated it as a simple residence. He rebuilt, he revised, imported ideas, and experimented with materials and mechanisms. He altered rooms after returning from Europe, who changed architectural details long after many owners would have considered the work complete. Each revision required labour and materials. Bricks had to be made, timber had to be cut, glass had to be purchased, hardware had to be fitted, skilled workers had to be supported or hired. Even when enslaved labour reduced some direct costs, construction still consumed enormous resources. The house became a physical record of Jefferson's imagination. It also became a financial burden. You walk through the parlour, again, everything appears calm. A visitor might admire the proportions and never think about what they cost. That is one of the strange qualities of elegant architecture. When it succeeds, effort disappears. You see the finished line of a wall, you do not see the years of revision behind it. Jefferson's spending extended far beyond construction. Books cost money. Scientific instruments cost money. Furniture cost money. European goods cost money. Imported wines cost money. Travel cost money. Clothing, household supplies, repairs, transportation, and hospitality all added to the total. He also supported a large extended family. By his later years, Monticello had become home to children and grandchildren whose needs placed additional pressure on household resources. Jefferson rarely lived simply in the financial sense. Even when his personal manner could appear informal, the world surrounding him remained expensive. You imagine a merchant's account arriving. The paper is folded carefully. It contains several lines. One purchase seems manageable. Then another. Then another. The total grows. Jefferson understands arithmetic perfectly well. The problem is not that he cannot add. The problem is that knowing the number does not make it disappear. His agricultural income often failed to match his obligations. Like many Virginia planters of his class, Jefferson had long depended on land credit and enslaved labor. His wealth looked enormous when measured in acreage and human property, but large assets did not necessarily mean available cash. Plantations could appear prosperous while remaining deeply indebted. A poor harvest might reduce income, crop prices could fall, repairs continued regardless. Interest accumulated, family obligations did not wait for favorable weather. You step outside and look across the fields. Agriculture seems solid from a distance, distance. Land lies beneath your feet, crops grow, buildings stand, animals move behind fences. But financial stability built on farming could be surprisingly fragile. Soil became exhausted, weather changed yields, markets changed prices, transportation added expense, and Jefferson's agricultural experiments did not always produce the improvements he hoped for. He tried different crop rotations. He showed interest in wheat and other alternatives to tobacco, and experimented with new tools and methods. Some ideas were thoughtful, others worked less successfully in practice. The mountain again resisted perfect management. You remember the vineyard. Vines had failed to become the reliable source of American wine he imagined. Other crops offered their own disappointments, and experiment could be intellectually interesting while still losing money. That distinction became increasingly important. Jefferson's curiosity encouraged him to try new things. His financial situation required dependable returns. Those two impulses did not always agree. You continue along the fields and remember another uncomfortable fact. Enslaved people were counted among Jefferson's assets. This meant that debt did not exist separately from slavery. People could be mortgaged, they could be valued, they could be transferred, they could be sold to satisfy creditors. The financial structure surrounding Monticello placed human families directly inside Jefferson's economic calculations. You think back to the farm books. A name beside an age was not only a record of labour. In the legal and financial system of the time, it could also represent monetary value. This becomes especially important as Jefferson grows older. His debts are no longer a distant. They threaten what will happen after his death. You return toward the house. A guest may arrive while these worries are unfolding. Dinner must still be served. Wine may still appear at the table. The contrast is almost surreal. Monticello continues performing stability while its finances become increasingly unstable. Jefferson's reputation adds pressure. Turning away visitors would violate the hospitality expected of him and perhaps his own sense of generosity. Yet welcoming them costs more. He knows this. Still the guests come. You can imagine the frustration of watching your home become famous enough to attract people you cannot afford to entertain comfortably. There is a quiet irony in that. The more admired Monticello becomes, the harder it becomes to sustain. By the 1820s, Jefferson's debts had become severe. I explored possible solutions. One was a public lottery that would allow him to dispose of property in a way he hoped might relieve the burden. The proposal itself reveals how desperate the situation had become. Jefferson, once accustomed to thinking about national questions on an enormous scale, was now struggling with the survival of his own estate. The plan did not solve everything. Time was running out. You enter his cabinet again. The room is familiar now. The alcove bed waits nearby. Books crowd the space. Papers rest on tables. Perhaps financial accounts are among them. Jefferson can still write letters. He can still make plans. He can still calculate possibilities. But age changes the nature of the problem. There are fewer years ahead in which to repair decades of accumulated debt. I is not alone in bearing the consequences. His family will inherit them, and enslaved families face something far more serious. If the estate must be sold, they may be sold with it. This is where Jefferson's financial difficulties become painfully human. After his death, much of his property would indeed be sold. Furniture, books, animals, land, household objects, and people. Families who had lived near one another for years could be divided by sale. The debts beneath Monticello's beautiful rooms would continue shaping lives after Jefferson was gone. You pause at a window. The landscape outside looks almost unchanged. That is what makes financial collapse so difficult to see in a historic place. Debt leaves no stain on a wall. It makes no particular sound in the garden. A visitor can admire the dome without seeing an unpaid account. But the consequences gather quietly. Historians can reconstruct much of Jefferson's financial condition through letters, account books, legal documents, and estate record. Still, not every decision is easy to explain. How much did he understand the seriousness of his position at each stage? Why did some expensive habits continue? Which solutions did he genuinely believe might work? The documents provide clues, but personal denial, hope, obligation, and habit are difficult to measure. You resist the temptation to simplify him into a single flaw. His debts grew through inheritance, agricultural weakness, family obligations, lifestyle construction credit practices, and his own repeated choices. Several causes accumulated together, just like the house. Layer upon layer, you step outside once more. Evening settles over the mountain. The architecture still appears graceful. The garden still catches the final light. For decades, Jefferson had shaped Monticello as if careful design could bring order to the world around him. But money proved less obedient than brick. Age proved less flexible than architecture. And time measured so cleverly by the great clock continued moving in only one direction. Jefferson is now an old man. His movements slow. His health weakens. The mountain grows smaller around him as travel becomes more difficult. Books, family correspondence, memories, and unfinished plans gather closer. You leave the accounts behind and return to the rooms where his final years are beginning. Section 19. You return to Jefferson's private rooms and find that the mountain now feels smaller than it once did. Not physically. The Blue Ridge still stretches across the horizon. The garden still follows the slope. The great clock still measures the passing hours. But Jefferson's own world has begun to narrow. Age changes the way a familiar house is experienced. A staircase that once seemed merely inconvenient becomes difficult. A journey that once required planning becomes exhausting. A long afternoon at a writing table demands more patience from the body. By the 1820s, Jefferson's in his 80s. Hemings has lived through revolutions, diplomatic missions, political offices, building campaigns, family losses, agricultural experiments, and decades of correspondence. Now much of that world reaches him instead of the other way around. You imagine him sitting in the cabinet you already know so well. The alcove bed remains only a few steps away. Books surround him. Papers wait on the table. Light enters through the windows, changing gradually as clouds move across the mountain. The room has become both workplace and refuge. Jefferson still writes. Even in old age, correspondence continues to connect Monticello with people far beyond Virginia. Letters arrive from friends, former political allies, students, relatives, admirers, and strangers. Some ask for opinions. Some bring news. Others concern one of the projects that occupies Jefferson deeply during his final years, the University of Virginia. You can imagine how naturally education appealed to him. Books had shaped his life. He had spent decades thinking about systems of knowledge. Now he wanted to help create an institution where future generations could study science languages, philosophy, law, mathematics, and other subjects in a setting he considered intellectually ambitious. Jefferson helped plan the university's architecture as carefully as he planned Monticello. Again, buildings became ideas made visible. He designed an academical village organized around a central lawn with pavilions and student rooms arranged in deliberate order. The work gave his later years a sense of purpose. But it also demanded attention at a time when his energy was declining. You picture plans spread across the table. Columns, measurements, proportion, small corrections. Even late in life, Jefferson is still rearranging space. The habit has never left him. Yet his health increasingly limits what he can do. He suffered from several ailments in old age, including urinary and digestive problems that could leave him weak and uncomfortable. Walking became more difficult. Travel became less frequent. Visitors who once found Jefferson moving through gardens or riding across the countryside were more likely to encounter him close to the house. The mountain that had once been a base for constant intellectual movement becomes almost a boundary. You walk slowly with him toward a window. The landscape outside is familiar enough to feel like an old companion. He has watched these ridges in every season. He has seen mist collect below them. He has watched storms move across them. He has recorded temperatures while the same hills changed color through spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Now the view contains memory. A field may recall an old environment. A road may recall someone who once arrived there. A room may remind him of a family member who is gone. The house has become crowded not only with people and objects, but with years. Jefferson had experienced painful family losses long before his own final illness. His wife Martha had died in 1782 after only about 10 years of marriage. Several of their children died young. Friends and political contemporaries also disappeared with time. By old age, Jefferson belonged to a shrinking generation of people who remembered the American Revolution firsthand. That status made visitors even more curious about him. The mountain continued receiving strangers. You imagine how strange that must have felt. To you, Jefferson belongs to history. To the young people arriving at Monticello in the 1820s, he was already becoming history while still alive. They wanted to see him. They wanted to hear him speak. They wanted to carry away a memory. Some visitors described an elderly man whose body had grown frail while his mind remained engaged. As always, such recollections must be treated carefully. People meeting a famous person often remember what they hope to find. Admiration can soften details. Later memory can turn an ordinary gesture into a meaningful symbol. You cannot know exactly how Jefferson appeared on every afternoon of his final years, but the broad pattern is clear. He was physically declining while still surrounding himself with ideas. You return to the books. After selling his great library to Congress years earlier, Jefferson had collected again. Volumes once more crowded his rooms. Either debt had not cured him of the habit. Books were necessities in his own mind. There is something almost touching and frustrating about that persistence. He knows his finances are in trouble. He knows the estate carries obligations, yet a life built around curiosity is difficult to dismantle simply because arithmetic demands it. The same is true of hospitality. Guests still come. Family members still depend upon the household. Food still must be prepared. Buildings still require repair. The old systems continue consuming resources. You sense the weight of all this around him. Monticello is beautiful, but it is no longer light. Every room carries cost. Every possession must eventually go somewhere. Every debt will outlive the person who created it unless it is paid. And for enslaved families, the approaching end of Jefferson's life creates particular uncertainty. His death will not mean freedom for most of them. Instead, the estate's debts will place many people at risk of sale. You think again of Mulberry Row, of workshops, of children, of families whose histories are tied to this mountain. Jefferson's failing health is therefore not only a private matter. An entire community has reason to wonder what will happen when he is gone. Most of those thoughts were never recorded. You cannot know exactly what enslaved families said to one another as Jefferson weakened. Perhaps some discussed rumors about debt. Perhaps they worried about separation. Perhaps they tried to predict which relatives might be sold. The evidence cannot recover every conversation, but the uncertainty itself would have been real. Inside the house, time continues to move. The great clock marks another hour. Its weights descend through the wall just as they did years earlier. Jefferson once turned their movement into a playful calendar. Now the symbolism feels different. Monday becomes Tuesday. Tuesday becomes Wednesday. The mechanism is unchanged. The man beneath it is not. By the summer of 1826, Jefferson's health had deteriorated seriously. He remained at Monticello surrounded by family. Outside July brought heat insects, green fields, and long daylight to the mountain. Inside the household became quieter around his illness. He died on July 4, 1826. The date was extraordinary. It was the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And on that same day, John Adam Jefferson's old political rival and later correspondent also died in Massachusetts. You do not need to make the coincidence louder than it is. History occasionally produces moments that already feel complete without decoration. Two elderly men connected with the founding generation died on the same national anniversary hundreds of miles apart. At Monticello, however, the moment was not an abstract historical symbol. It was a death inside a family home. Rooms became still. Relatives grieved. The man who had redesigned this mountain for nearly 60 years was gone. But Monticello could not simply close around his memory. The debts remained. The household remained. The enslaved families remained. Furniture, books, livestock, land, and personal possessions now entered the practical processes of an estate that had to settle what Jefferson left behind. The mountain was about to change owners. Objects would leave rooms. Families would be dispersed. Jefferson's carefully constructed world would begin coming apart. You stand quietly near the house as the evening light fades. For the first time in your journey, Monticello exists without Jefferson inside it. And what happens next may reveal more about the house than almost anything that happened while he was alive. Section 20. You remain on the mountain after Jefferson's death, but Monticello no longer feels quite the same. The house still stands beneath the Virginia scale. The dome still rises above the trees. The great clock remains inside. Gardens continue responding to rain and sunlight, and the Blue Ridge Mountains still fade into layers of quiet blue beyond the windows. But the person who spent nearly 60 years altering this place is gone. Now the careful world he assembled begins to come apart. Jefferson died deeply in debt. Death did not erase what he owed, so his estate had to be examined, valued, and reduced to property that could help satisfy creditors. That process reached almost everything. Furniture could be sold. Livestock could be sold. Tools could be sold. Household goods could be sold. Land could eventually change hands. And because Virginia law treated enslaved people as property, human beings could be sold as well. You have spent many hours walking through Monticello as a home. Now you're forced to see it as an estate inventory. The transformation is unsettling. A chair that once stood beside a table acquires a price. A horse acquires a price. A piece of equipment acquires a price. Then a person's name appears beside another monetary value. The same plantation records that helped you recover families now reveal how easily the economic system could divide them. In January 1827, an auction was held as Jefferson's estate was dispersed. More than 100 enslaved people were sold. You imagine the mountain that winter. The trees are bare. Cold air settles over the grounds. Smoke rises from chimneys. Families who have lived near one another for years wait without knowing exactly what comes next. Some people are purchased by relatives or local buyers. Others leave the mountain. Family networks are disrupted. A familiar path, workshop, cabin, garden, or kitchen may be seen for the last time. The sale reminds you that Jefferson's death was experienced very differently depending on who you were. For his white family, it meant grief and financial difficulty. For many enslaved families, it could also mean forced separation. The home could vanish because someone else had died owing money. Not everyone connected with the Hemings family was sold. Jefferson's will formally freed several members of the Hemings family, including Madison and Eston Hemings, while others had previously been allowed to leave. Sally Hemings herself was not formally emancipated by Jefferson's will, but his daughter Martha later allowed her to live freely in Charlottesville. These exceptions were unusual. They also reveal the personal decisions hidden inside a system where freedom depended upon the choices of the person claiming ownership. You watch people leave Monticello in your imagination. A wagon moves down the road. Footsteps follow. The mountain grows quieter. There is no surviving record of every goodbye. You do not know which relatives embraced. You do not know what objects people carried with them. You do not know whether someone turned back for one final look at the house. Those details disappeared, but the dispersal itself is well established. Monticello had been a community. Now much of that community was scattered. The house also faced an uncertain future. Jefferson's surviving family could not comfortably preserve the estate exactly as he had left it. Within several years, Monticello was sold. It passed first to James Turner Barclay, a local apothecary who experimented with raising silkworms on the property. Jefferson's carefully designed home briefly became part of someone else's experiment. There is a gentle historical irony in that. Even without Jefferson, the mountain attracted plans. Then another owner arrived whose connection with Monticello would prove much more lasting. Uriah Phillips Levy, a United States naval officer and an admirer of Jefferson, purchased Monticello in the 1830s. Levy was Jewish and had faced anti-Semitism during his naval career. He admired Jefferson, especially for his writings on religious liberty. To Levy, preserving Monticello was not simply about owning an attractive plantation house. The building represented ideas he valued. You walk through the rooms decades after Jefferson's death. Some things have changed. Furniture has disappeared. Original possessions have been scattered. Repairs are needed. Land use shifts, yet the house remains recognizable. Levy works to preserve it. Later, Monticello becomes entangled in family disputes and the disruptions of the Civil War era. Ownership and maintenance become complicated. For a time, the future of the house seems uncertain again. Eventually, Uriah Levy's nephew, Jefferson Monroe. Levy takes responsibility for Monticello and carries out substantial repairs. He too becomes an important figure in the survival of the building. This part of the story is sometimes overlooked. Historic houses do not preserve themselves. Roofs leak, wood rots, paint fails, water enters walls, windows break, gardens disappear. Without repeated human intervention, even famous architecture slowly returns to the landscape. Monticello survived because generations after Jefferson decided that it should. In 2023, the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation acquired the property. The organization, now known as the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, began the long process of preserving, restoring, researching, and interpreting Monticello for the public. At first, much of the attention naturally centered on Jefferson, his architecture, his presidency, his books, his inventions, his famous rooms. Visitors climbed the mountain to enter the home of a founding figure. But historical interpretation changes as new questions are asked. Over time, archaeology and documentary research increasingly turned toward the people whose lives earlier presentations had often pushed to the edges. Mulberry Row became essential. Enslaved families became essential. The Hemings family became essential. Oral histories from descendants became essential. The mountain began telling more than one person's story. So return to Mulberry Row. Many original structures are gone, but archaeology has uncovered foundations, fragments, tools, ceramics, nails, and other traces of the people who lived and worked here. A small piece of broken pottery can become important. So can a button, a nail, an animal bone, a patch of altered soil. These objects do not speak loudly. They do not need to. They allow historians to reconstruct daily life from materials that previous generations might have ignored. You think about how appropriate that feels for your journey. I'll begin by looking for the quiet details. A bed inside a wall, a clock weight disappearing through a floor, a revolving door, a thermometer, a seed, a bottle, a letter copied by 2 pens. Now the smallest objects help restore people to the story. Monticello itself has become a kind of historical document. Walls show alterations. Paint reveals older colors. Foundations reveal vanished buildings. Landscapes preserve relationships between work and residence. Jefferson's papers explain some things. Archaeology corrects or expands others. Descendant testimony adds memories absent from official records. And still uncertainty remains. Historians do not know exactly where every person stood on every day. Some buildings cannot be reconstructed perfectly. Some relationships remain partly hidden. Some objects have disappeared forever. Sally Hemings left no known written account in her own voice. Many enslaved people at Monticello remain known only through a few lines in other people's records. The gaps cannot simply be filled with the imagination and called fact. You have learned to walk around them carefully. That care does not weaken the story. It makes the story more complete. Monticello is no longer simply Jefferson's remarkable house. It is a place where invention existed beside exploitation. Beauty existed beside debt. Intellectual freedom existed beside human enslavement. Family affection existed beside family separation. Curiosity flourished within a system that gave one man extraordinary control over the lives of others. These truths do not cancel one another. They must remain together. You return one final time to the entrance hall. The great clock waits above you. Its weights still descend along the wall. Saturday still requires more space than Jefferson originally allowed. The small architectural mistakes of ease. You look toward the maps and objects, then toward the rooms filled with books. Beyond them lies the alcove bed. Farther away are the kitchen, cellar terraces, orchards, workshops, and archaeological remains of Mulberry Row. The house feels different from when you first arrived. Then it seemed to contain Jefferson's secrets. Now you understand that Monticello was never truly about secrets. It was about things that became invisible when people chose not to look closely. Labor hidden behind revolving doors. Families hidden behind property lists. Cost hidden beneath elegance. Human stories hidden behind one famous name. The mountain has not revealed everything, but it has taught you where to look. Word count 1 honko. The evening has become very quiet now. You step outside Monticello one final time and allow the door to close gently behind you. The brick walls remain warm from the day, but the air above the mountain has begun to cool. A soft breeze passes through the trees. Far away the Blue Ridge has almost disappeared into darkness. You walk slowly across the lawn. There is nowhere else you need to reach tonight. Behind you rests the unusual house with its hidden lifts, narrow stairs, crowded shelves, strange clock, careful measurements, and countless unfinished plans. Beyond it lie the garden terraces where seeds once arrived from distant places. Farther along the ridge rests Mulberry Row, quieter now than it was when hammers, voices, footsteps, and cooking fires filled the air. You remember those sounds without needing to hold them tightly. History rarely leaves a complete story behind. It leaves a doorway, a name, a broken cup, a letter, a planting date, a foundation beneath the soil. Sometimes it leaves a silence asking you to notice who was not given the opportunity to write their own page. Tonight you have walked through those traces gently. The great clock continues somewhere behind the walls. A moment follows another. The mountain does not ask you to solve every contradiction before you leave. It simply holds them, light and shadow, achievement and failure, freedom and enslavement, memory and forgetting. You begin descending the mountain road. The house grows smaller between the trees. Soon the dome disappears. Only the dark outline of the ridge remains beneath a wide Virginia sky. And as the last imagined footsteps fade behind you, Monticello returns to stillness. The books are closed. The garden rests. The clocks continue quietly without you. And history for tonight can sleep